What if the answer to your racing thoughts wasn't to think more but to think less? In a world that never stops talking, Zen offers a quiet voice, a whisper, not a shout. These 3 hours of Zen teachings invite you to slow down, breathe, and gently step out of the storm of your mind. Through simple stories and timeless wisdom, you'll learn how to stop chasing peace and instead let it find you. Let's get started. The monk who forgot his name. In a small mountain monastery where fog rolled over the tiles like drifting dreams, there lived a monk who had once been praised for his knowledge. He had studied many scriptures and recited them flawlessly. He was known for his sharp memory, his clarity in debates, and his disciplined lifestyle. People came from far villages just to hear him speak. But one morning, as he was preparing to give a talk, he paused before saying his name. His mind was completely blank. He smiled nervously, then chuckled, but still nothing. He couldn't remember his name at all, not even the sound of it. The other monks were concerned. They brought him to the abbot, who listened with calm eyes. The abbot asked him, "Are you in pain?" "No." "Are you confused?" "No, I just can't remember who I am." The abbot nodded. "Then, perhaps, you are closer to awakening than you think." In the days that followed, the monk stopped speaking altogether. He no longer sat in the front during ceremonies. He no longer led chants or offered advice. He simply swept the temple grounds, drank tea, and watched the clouds drift across the sky. Some whispered that he had lost his mind. Others believed he had fallen from his path. But in truth, something deep within him was changing. Without the burden of his name, the monk stopped thinking of himself as anyone at all. He no longer remembered whether he was wise or ordinary, praised or ignored. He stopped comparing. He stopped performing. He simply was. His movements slowed. His breath deepened. He smiled more, though he rarely spoke. One day, a young novice asked him, "Does it bother you that you forgot who you are?" The monk looked at him gently and said, "I have not forgotten. I have just remembered something deeper." And with that, he returned to sweeping the path, leaving behind no name, no title, only the quiet sound of the broom moving through dust and fallen leaves. Moral of the story: freedom comes not from adding more to who we are, but from letting go of what we think we must be. When we forget the labels we carry, we remember the peace that has always been within. The next story is called A Teacup Filled with Silence. In a quiet village nestled between two gentle hills, there lived an old tea master known not for his words, but for his silence. People from all over would visit his little house to ask questions about life, wisdom, and peace. But the tea master never gave direct answers. Instead, he simply poured tea. One day, a young scholar, full of ambition and pride, traveled from the city to meet him. He had studied countless books and could quote many sutras by heart. He believed wisdom came from knowing more, and he was eager to prove himself. He entered the tea master's home and bowed respectfully, then began speaking without pause. He talked about everything he had read, every insight he thought he had gained. The old master nodded gently, offering no interruption, only the sound of hot water being poured into a small, simple cup. The scholar continued, louder now, speaking about karma, meditation, even enlightenment. All the while, the master continued to pour. The cup filled to the brimthon began to overflow. Hot tea spilled onto the floor, soaking the table. Startled, the scholar shouted, "Stop! The cup is full! Can't you see?" The tea master looked up slowly, his eyes calm like still water. "Yes," he said softly, "and so is your mind." The scholar froze. The master set down the teapot and slid the full cup across the table. "How can I offer anything when you are already full of your own thoughts?" Shamed and humbled, the scholar sat in silence for the first time that day. The master did not speak again. They sat together as steam rose from the cup and faded into the quiet air. In that moment, the scholar felt something he had never found in book stillness. Not the silence of a room, but the silence within himself, a silence that spoke louder than words. Moral of the story: when the mind is crowded with noise and pride, no wisdom can enter. True learning begins with emptiness. Like a teacup, we must empty ourselves of assumptions and ego to receive the deep peace waiting to be poured into us. The next story is called Whispers from the Cracked Bell. In an old Zen temple perched high above a valley of clouds, there hung a large bronze bell. Once, it had been the pride of the temple gift from a generous emperor. Its deep, perfect sound echoed across mountains, calling monks to meditation and prayer. But over the years, a crack formed down its side. At first, it was small. Then the crack widened, and eventually the bell no longer rang with the same power. Its voice became uneven, sometimes low, sometimes too soft to hear. The temple elders considered replacing it. Some younger monks said it no longer served its purpose. But the abbot refused. "Let the bell stay," he said. "Its sound still carries wisdom." Visitors to the temple noticed it too. When the bell was struck, it no longer boomed with authority. Instead, it released a trembling, broken sound that rose and fell like a whisper carried by the wind. At first, people found it strange, but over time, they began to sit quietly after hearing it. Something about its tone made them feel something unspoken. It was as if the bell wasn't calling to them, but with them. One monk, struggling with feelings of failure and shame, approached the abbot. "Why do I feel more seen by this cracked bell than by any of your teachings?" he asked. The abbot smiled gently, "Because the bell no longer hides its wound." The monk sat beneath the bell for hours that day, listening not to its sound, but to its silence between sounds. He realized he had spent years trying to be perfect, afraid to let others see his cracks. But the cracked bell still rang. It still served. In its brokenness, it had become more human, and somehow that made it even more sacred. Moral of the story: our flaws do not make us unworthy, they make us real. Like the cracked bell, what is broken in us can still offer beauty, truth, and healing. Sometimes, the softest whispers come from what we tried hardest to hide. And in that quiet, we find connection. The next story is called One Breath, One Mountain. Long ago, high in the snowy peaks of the eastern lands, a quiet Zen hermit lived alone in a small wooden hut. He had left the noise of the world behind, no letters, no visitors, no teachings, only the sky, the wind, and his breath. People in the village below whispered stories about him, that he had once been a great teacher, that he had abandoned his monastery after a deep sorrow, or that he had gone mad from meditating too long in silence. One spring, a young seeker climbed the long and dangerous trail to find him. The seeker had tried every teaching, every retreat, every book he could find. Still, his mind raced constantly. He feared the future, regretted the past, and couldn't stop thinking even in meditation. He believed the old hermit held the final answer. When he reached the hut, the hermit was sitting on a flat stone, gazing at the sky. The seeker bowed deeply and asked, "Please, Master, teach me how to calm my mind. I have traveled far. I have studied much. I have tried everything." The hermit looked at him and said only, "One breath, one mountain." The seeker blinked. "What do you mean? Is that a mantra? A riddle?" The hermit simply smiled and returned to his stillness. The seeker stayed for several days, repeating the phrase silently, "One breath, one mountain." But his mind remained busy. He grew frustrated. "Why won't he explain?" he shouted inside himself. One morning, exhausted, he stepped outside at dawn and saw the mountain glowing gold under the rising sun. For the first time, He didn't name it, didn't label it, didn't analyze it. He just breathed. The mountain didn't move, it didn't speak, it just was vast, present, silent. And so was he. In that breath, he understood. He didn't need more teachings. He needed to be still enough to feel the weight of one breath, the power of one moment, the truth that everything, the mountain, the breath, the self, was already complete. Moral of the story: peace doesn't come from collecting more answers, but from fully meeting the moment you're in. Like a mountain resting in silence, your breath is enough. One breath, when truly felt, can carry the stillness of an entire mountain. The next story is called When the Wind Stared Back. There was a young monk who often wandered beyond the temple walls, drawn to the open fields and wide skies. He loved the feeling of the wind brushing against his face. It made him feel alive, free, untouchable. Yet, inside his mind, he felt the opposite: tight, restless, uncertain. No matter how long he meditated or how many teachings he recited, thoughts came rushing in like waves crashing on a shore. One evening, while walking through the tall grass near a cliff's edge, he shouted into the wind, "Why won't you leave me alone?" The wind answered with silence, but not the kind that comforts. This silence pressed on him, as if something was watching, something vast and wordless. That night, he returned to the temple shaken. He went to the old Zen master and whispered, "I think the wind stared back at me." The master poured tea, then said, "Ah, you finally saw yourself." The monk frowned. "But I look in the mirror every morning." The master chuckled softly. "The mirror shows your face. The wind shows your mind." The monk didn't understand. So the master told him to return to the cliff at dawn and sit there without moving until he understood. The next morning, as the sun rose, the monk sat cross-legged in the chill. The wind blew hard. His robe flapped wildly. His eyes watered. Thoughts returned loud, judgmental, relentless. "Why are you here? What if nothing happens? What if you fail again?" And suddenly, he saw it. The wind wasn't just touching his skin, it was moving through his thoughts, stirring them, revealing them, echoing them. For the first time, he didn't try to block the thoughts. He watched them come and go, just like the wind, some warm, some cold, some loud, some soft. But none of them stayed. In that moment, he realized he wasn't the wind. He wasn't even the thoughts. He was the one watching both. And in that silent watcher, there was no fear, no tension, just vastness. Moral of the story: sometimes what disturbs us most is not the world outside, but seeing ourselves clearly for the first time. When we stop running from our thoughts and watch them like passing wind, we find the quiet place within that is never moved. The next story is called The Spider Who Wove Emptiness. In the beams of an old Zen temple deep in the forest, a small spider made her home. She spun her web high above the meditation hall, far from the sight of monks or visitors. Every morning, when the monks gathered to chant and sit in silence, the spider began weaving. She did not spin her web to catch flies. There were hardly any. She spun because that's what she was made to do. Her web was delicate, almost invisible, so thin that even the morning light passed through it like breath. She built, broke, and rebuilt it each day, with quiet devotion. One young monk, burdened with thoughts and struggling with doubt, often stared upward during meditation. He noticed the spider and grew distracted by her movements. He felt frustrated. "Why can I not concentrate?" he asked himself. "Why do I keep watching that spider? Why can't I empty my mind like the others?" One day, after the morning sitting, he approached the abbot. "Master," he said, "my mind will not stay still. I try to follow my breath, but I keep watching that little spider on the ceiling. It pulls me away from emptiness." The abbot looked up at the rafters, then gently smiled. "She is not pulling you away. She is teaching you." The monk frowned. "Teaching me? But she does nothing." "She does everything," the abbot replied. "She weaves from nothing, and she weaves into nothing. Her thread is invisible. Her purpose is simple. She leaves no trace, and yet she does not stop. She does not ask why. That is emptiness, not silence without life, but action without attachment." That night, the monk sat again, eyes softly open, watching the spider. This time, he did not think. He simply breathed with her. He noticed how each thread held tension without fear, how the web shimmered without needing to be seen, how the spider's whole world rose and fell with each breath of wind. And for the first time, his thoughts slowed. His chest softened. His breath deepened. In her quiet weaving, he found the stillness he had been chasing. Moral of the story: emptiness is not the absence of action, but the absence of clinging. Like the spider's web, true presence is built from quiet intention and released without attachment. In simplicity we find freedom. In the invisible, we often find the truth. The next story is called The Dog That Never Barked Again. In a small village by the river, there lived a stray dog that everyone knew. It had no name, no owner, but it was always there, barking at strangers, chasing carts, guarding the temple steps, as if it had been assigned a duty by heaven itself. The villagers both feared and respected it. Its bark echoed through the streets at all hours, sharp and loud, as if it were always warning something away. One day, the dog suddenly stopped barking. People noticed the silence first. They waited, curious. Days passed. Then weeks. The dog still walked the same paths, still sat in its usual spots, but it no longer barked, not even once. Some thought it had grown old. Others believed it had lost its spirit. The children missed its wild voice. But the monks at the temple watched closely. One evening, a young monk sat beside the dog, watching the sunset. "Why don't you bark anymore?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer. The dog turned its head slowly, eyes calm and distant, as if they held the memory of too many storms. The abbot, standing nearby, spoke instead. The dog barked at everything it didn't understand. Every sound, every shadow, every shape it thought was danger. The monk looked down. "And now?" The abbot smiled. "Now, it has seen that most of the danger was in its own mind." The dog yawned and lay down. The sky faded to purple, and the temple bell rang once in the distance. That night, the monk lay awake, thinking of all the things he barked at in his own way, his judgments, his fears, his anger. He realized how often his mind reacted, defended, shouted within, even when nothing was truly wrong. The silence of the dog spoke louder than any lecture. From then on, whenever the monk felt his thoughts rising in panic or blame, he imagined the dog beside him, resting, watching, not barking. And he, too, slowly learned the peace of quiet. Moral of the story: many of our thoughts are like barking dogs, reacting to shadows, protecting illusions. But when we stop barking at life, we begin to listen, and in that listening, we find freedom from fear. The next story is called Sand, Writing in a Rainstorm. There was once a monk who lived near the ocean, where the wind was constant and the clouds always seemed close to rain. Each morning at dawn, he would walk to the shore and write one word in the sand with a long stick. The word changed every day, sometimes peace, sometimes truth, sometimes just his own name. Then he would sit and meditate until the tide erased his writing or the rain washed it away. One morning, a traveler who had been watching from a distance finally approached him. She was soaked from the storm and weary from wandering, her eyes full of questions. "Why do you write in the sand?" she asked. "You know it never lasts." The monk looked up and said softly, "That is why I write." Confused, the traveler pressed on. "But if it disappears so quickly, what is the point?" The monk smiled and returned his gaze to the sea. "What I write is not meant to remain, it is meant to remind." Still unsatisfied, the traveler sat beside him as the rain began to fall harder, blurring the word he had just written. She watched as the letters faded, each stroke slowly swallowed by water. And something stirred in her chest, a quiet sadness at first, then a strange kind of relief. They sat together for a long time. The monk didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Later that night, the traveler sat alone under the temple's wooden eaves. She remembered the names, regrets, and mistakes she had been carrying for years. Heavy names etched deeply in her heart, as if carved in stone. But now she imagined writing them in sand, letting the storm take them. And she began to cry, not from grief, but from the gentle truth of impermanence. Moral of the story: not everything is meant to last, and that is not a loss, but a freedom. The things we hold on to the tightest are often the ones we need to release. Like words in the sand during a rainstorm, our thoughts, fears, and identities can be washed away, making space for something softer to arrive. The next story is called The Cloud That Wouldn't Move. High above a quiet mountain temple, the sky was wide and blue except for one cloud. It was large, gray, and heavy, hanging low above the meditation garden. Day after day, it remained in the same place, unmoving. The villagers noticed. So did the monks. While other clouds came and went with the wind, this one refused to drift. At first, no one paid much attention, but as weeks passed, the cloud began to feel oppressive. It blocked the sun. It made the garden feel colder. Some monks believed it was a bad sign. Others said it must be a spirit. One even tried to chant it away. The young monks grew anxious. "Why won't it move?" they asked the head monk, who had been watching silently from under the old cedar tree. He finally said, "Sit with it." So they did. Each morning they gathered in the garden and meditated beneath the stubborn cloud. At first, they resented it. The lack of sunlight made them uncomfortable. Their thoughts grew heavy. One monk whispered, "This cloud is ruining my focus." But the head monk said nothing. One day, a novice broke into tears during sitting. "I try to be calm, but this cloud makes me feel stuck, like something inside me won't move either." The head monk opened his eyes. "Then perhaps this cloud came for you." The novice looked up, confused. The head monk continued, "We are taught to watch our thoughts like clouds in the sky, to let them come and go. But what happens when a cloud stays?" The garden fell silent. He went on, "Some thoughts like sorrow, shame, or regret pass quickly. We beg them to leave. But in doing so, we resist them, we fight them, and that keeps them right where they are." The monks stared at the cloud. It didn't look angry, just quiet, just there. Over time, they stopped resisting it. They stopped waiting for it to leave. And one morning, without warning, the cloud was gone. The garden was filled with sunlight. But strangely, they missed the stillness it had taught them. Moral of the story: not every heavy feeling is a problem to solve. Some clouds stay to teach us how to sit still, how to accept, how to breathe through the discomfort. And when we stop pushing, even the unmoving begins to shift. The next story is called Eating Soup with a Needle. In a quiet Zen monastery surrounded by pine trees and falling leaves, a young monk grew frustrated with meditation. Every day, he sat on his cushion, trying to stop his thoughts, trying to be calm, trying to reach enlightenment. But his mind kept racing plans, memories, worries, distractions. The harder he tried, the more restless he felt. After weeks of struggle, he went to the old master, his voice tight with confusion. "Master," he said, "I am doing everything right. I sit, I breathe, I try not to think. But still, nothing happens. No peace, no silence, no enlightenment. What am I doing wrong? The master said nothing. Instead, he led the young monk into the kitchen. He poured hot soup into a bowl and handed it to the monk. Then, with a blank face, he handed him a needle. "Eat," the master said. The monk looked down, puzzled. "Master, how can I eat soup with a needle?" The old man looked at him calmly. "Exactly." The monk stared at the thin, sharp needle. He tried to dip it into the soup and bring it to his mouth, but each time the soup fell away. He grew impatient, then angry. The master only watched in silence. After several failed attempts, the monk set down the bowl. "This is useless," he muttered. The master nodded slowly. "And so is chasing peace with effort." The young monk blinked. "What do you mean?" "You try to get peace the way you try to eat soup, with a needle focusing so hard, forcing every move, measuring every drop. But peace is not found through control. It is received when you stop grasping and simply allow yourself to be nourished." The monk sat quietly, the heat of the soup rising between them. He felt his breath slow, his shoulders relax. For the first time, he didn't try to fix his thoughts. He didn't try to change his mind. He just sat. The soup remained untouched, but something inside him began to soften. Moral of the story: peace cannot be forced, and stillness cannot be hunted. Like eating soup with a needle, the harder we try to grasp it, the more it slips away. When we stop trying so hard and simply sit with what is, the nourishment we seek begins to find us. The next story is called The Man Who Argued with Echoes. There once lived a man in a quiet valley surrounded by steep cliffs and deep woods. He was known in the nearby town for having strong opinions and a louder voice than most. He believed he was always right about everything. Whenever someone disagreed with him, he would raise his voice, speak faster, and insist until others gave in or walked away. But the more he argued, the lonelier he felt. People began to avoid him, so he took to walking alone in the hills, where he could speak freely without judgment. One afternoon, frustrated by an old conversation still playing in his head, he climbed to a high ridge and shouted his anger into the open air. To his surprise, a voice shouted back. He paused, thinking someone was nearby. "Who's there?" he barked. "Who's there?" came the reply. He frowned. "Stop mocking me." "Stop mocking me!" the voice echoed again. The man scowled. "Coward! Coward!" He grew red in the face. "Say that to my face." The cliffs responded, "Say that to my face." Realizing it was only his echo, the man sat down, breathing hard. His heart pounded, his fists clenched. But the longer he sat, the more he noticed something strange. The echo wasn't only repeating his words, it was mirroring his energy, his tension, his bitterness. He whispered, "Why are you so angry?" And the voice returned, "Why are you so angry?" It hit him like thunder in his chest. The answer wasn't from the mountains, it was from himself. He sat in silence, listening to the wind instead of his own shouting. For the first time, he heard birdsong, the rustling of leaves, and his own breath. That day, he returned to the village quieter, not because he had lost his voice, but because he had found its weight. People still disagreed with him sometimes, but he no longer argued. He listened, because he had learned that shouting into the world only brings the same noise back. Moral of the story: life often reflects what we project. When we argue with the world, we end up arguing with ourselves. But when we quiet our voice, we begin to hear what truly needs to be heard within and beyond. The next story is called The Mirror That Reflected No One. In a hidden hall deep within a mountain temple, there stood a mirror unlike any other. It had no frame, no shine, no shimmer. Its surface looked dull, like old river stone. Many visitors passed by it, not even knowing it was a mirror at all. But those who stayed long enough, those who truly looked, felt something they could not explain. Legend said the mirror had once belonged to a great Zen master who sought to understand the nature of the self. He meditated for years, asking the question, "Who am I?" over and over, until even the question itself dissolved. When he died, the monks found this mirror in his hut, with only one phrase carved beneath it: "What is not seen is closest to the truth." Centuries later, a monk named Jorin stood before the mirror. He was young, devoted, and full of doubt. He had trained his body and memorized the sutras. But still, he could not shake the feeling that something was missing. He longed for a breakthrough, some proof of progress, some sign of awakening. When he heard the story of the mirror, he climbed the cold stone steps alone in the dark, hoping to find answers. He bowed and looked into it. But he saw nothing. No reflection, no face, not even the flicker of his eyes. He stared harder. He moved left, then right. He wiped the surface with his sleeve. Still nothing. His heart raced. "Is it broken?" he whispered aloud. "Is this a test?" But the mirror remained silent, empty. Jorin sat in front of it for hours. Thoughts came and went. Anger, confusion, fear. Slowly, even those faded. Then something strange happened. The longer he sat, the more peaceful he felt. Without a face staring back, there was no identity to defend, no ego to polish, just presence, just stillness. For the first time, he did not try to understand himself. He simply allowed himself to not be anyone. And in that quiet, he felt more whole than ever before. Moral of the story: the truest mirror shows nothing, not because it is empty, but because it is free. When we stop needing to see ourselves, we begin to feel what lies beyond identity. In letting go of who we think we are, we come closer to what we've always been. The next story is called Shoes Left Outside. Forever. At the edge of a pine forest stood an old Zen temple, so still it seemed the wind itself bowed before entering. Visitors were few, but those who came knew one thing: you must always leave your shoes outside the temple door. It was a simple rule, passed down through generations, a practice of respect and letting go. One autumn morning, a traveler arrived, dusty, tired, and full of questions. He had studied many paths, met many teachers, and still felt restless inside. He believed he was close to understanding life, but something was missing, something he couldn't name. Hoping for clarity, he sought the wisdom of the temple's old master. Before entering, he removed his shoes and placed them neatly beside dozens of others. Some were worn and patched, some were delicate and fine, but all of them were quiet. Inside, he sat with the master for hours. No words were exchanged, no teachings offered, just the sound of wind brushing through paper walls and the scent of incense curling upward. The traveler's mind, full of thoughts at first, slowly began to settle like a stirred pond, returning to stillness. After what felt like a lifetime and a moment all at once, he rose to leave. At the doorway, he reached for his shoes but stopped. They were gone. He looked around, puzzled. The master, now beside him, simply said, "Perhaps you don't need them anymore." The traveler frowned. "But how will I return?" The master looked into his eyes, soft and clear. "Return to where?" The traveler opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. He stood still for a long time. Then, barefoot, he stepped off the temple platform and walked slowly into the trees. The earth beneath his feet felt strange, tender, real. He didn't know where he was going, and for the first time, that felt completely right. Years later, the shoes remained missing. Some said they were taken by another traveler. Others believed the master had hidden them. But among the monks, the truth was gently whispered. He never came to take them back. Moral of the story: sometimes what we leave behind in silence frees us more than what we carry forward. When we let go of who we were even for a moment, we step barefoot into the life waiting quietly beyond our expectations. The next story is called The Pond That Drank the Sky. In the heart of a quiet valley, hidden by willows and soft moss, there was a pond so still it looked like glass. It was said that the sky lived in that pond, not just its color, but its silence, its endlessness. Birds flew overhead, clouds drifted by, and the pond held them all without effort. It never clutched, never claimed, never asked anything in return. It simply received. A monk named Haku came to live beside this pond after many years of wandering. He was worn down, not by age, but by thinking too much, too deeply, too constantly. He had studied philosophy, argued with teachers, sat in long meditations, all trying to find the nature of reality, but his mind would not rest. It was full of questions that led to more questions, like a hallway of doors that only opened to more doors. One evening, after a restless day, Haku sat by the pond with his legs crossed and his breath shallow. He looked up at the fading sky layers of gold, blue and gray folding into one another. Then he looked down. The pond reflected it all. He watched as a cloud passed slowly across the water's surface. The pond didn't react. It didn't try to keep the image or change it. It let the cloud appear and fade with equal peace. A breeze came, and the reflection disappeared in ripples. The pond didn't resist. It simply moved, then settled again. Suddenly, Haku felt tears fall down his cheeks, quiet, unexpected tears. Not from sadness, but from recognition. All his life, he had been trying to understand the sky. But the pond had never tried to understand anything. It only received. It held what passed through it and let it go. It mirrored, but it never clung. That night, Haku did not meditate. He did not recite teachings. He simply sat beside the pond and breathed with it, his heart finally as still as the water. Moral of the story: peace comes not from grasping the sky, but from becoming like the ponderpen, still and willing to reflect without holding. When we let thoughts pass through us without chasing them, we discover a deeper truth. We were never separate from the sky at all. The next story is called Where the Clock Forgot to Tick. In the heart of a quiet forest, there was a hidden monastery known only to those who truly sought stillness. It had no signs, no maps, no written name. Those who found it said time felt different there, as if the wind moved slower and the leaves refused to fall until you were ready to see them. Inside its main hall, above the altar, hung an old wooden clock. Its hands were frozen. It never ticked. It never chimed. Visitors often stared at it, puzzled, assuming it was broken. But none dared ask. The monks moved gracefully, as if following another rhythm, one not measured by minutes or hours. One day, a restless man arrived. He had spent his life chasing success, answers, and meaning. He had attended every retreat, studied every tradition, and meditated by the book. Still, his thoughts ran wild. He couldn't sit still. He was always waiting for the next thing, the next breakthrough, the next version of peace. He entered the hall and sat before the silent clock, agitated. He whispered to a passing monk, "Why don't you fix the clock?" The monk replied softly, "Because nothing is broken." The man frowned. "But how do you know when to begin meditation? When to eat? When to end?" The monk paused. "When we're hungry, we eat. When we're tired, we rest. When the sun rises, we greet it. When the mind settles, we sit." The man scoffed. "But how do you keep track of time?" The monk smiled gently. "We don't. Time keeps track of us." The man stayed. Days passed, though he couldn't say how many. Slowly, the urgency inside him began to fade. He stopped checking his phone. He stopped watching the sun to guess the hour. He started listening to birds, to his footsteps, to the sound of his own breath. At first, it was unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. But then it became beautiful. And one morning, as he sat beneath the silent clock, he realized something had shifted. Not in the world, in him. He no longer needed to know what time it was. He was finally here. Moral of the story: peace lives where time loses its grip. When we stop measuring life by minutes and start feeling it with presence, we remember that the deepest moments can't be scheduled. They arrive only when the clock forgets to tick. The next story is called The Monk Who Meditated Inside a Volcano. High above the clouds, in a place where even birds dared not fly, there lived a monk in the shadow of a sleeping volcano. No one knew his name or where he came from. Some said he had once been a prince. Others believed he had lost everything in a great war and climbed the mountain in search of silence. But what was known by all was this: every morning, as steam hissed from cracks in the earth and the sky trembled with distant rumblings, the monk would sit at the very edge of the crater, eyes closed, back straight, unmoved. Many travelers tried to follow him, believing they too could find peace in such extremes. Most turned back. The heat, the fear, the raw noise of the earth was too much. How can anyone be still here? They would ask. The mountain could erupt at any moment. One day, a young monk named Riku made the climb, determined to understand. He found the old monk just before dawn, sitting silently as glowing embers flickered below. The air smelled of fire and ash. The earth growled beneath their feet. Riku stood trembling. "Master," he called out, "how can you sit in peace on the mouth of destruction?" The monk opened his eyes slowly. There was no fear in the lonely space, like an open sky. "Because I do not mistake the volcano for the problem," he said. "It is only loud. My thoughts are louder." Riku was confused. "But the volcano could explode. Doesn't that frighten you?" The monk turned his gaze to the rising steam. "One day it may erupt, but most people live their whole lives as if the eruption is already happening. Their minds burn constantly, always reacting, always afraid. I sit here not to escape the fire, but to face it, so I learn that the fire inside me can be cooled." Riku sat beside him, still shaking. The heat pressed into his skin. The mountain roared beneath them. But as his breath slowed, he began to see. The volcano was not shouting at him. It was simply being what it was. And in that, so could he. Moral of the story: peace is not found in the absence of danger, but in the absence of resistance. When we stop fighting the fire and learn to sit with it, the chaos outside cannot burn the stillness within. Even in the heart of a volcano, the mind can rest. The next story is called Letters Written on Smoke. In a quiet village surrounded by misty hills, there lived an old calligrapher who was once renowned across the land. Kings and monks alike had sought his brushwork words that seemed to float with both elegance and weight. But in his final years, he stopped writing on paper. Instead, every morning before the sun rose, he would light a small fire in a stone basin and burn slender reeds and dried herbs. With a long brush dipped in water, he began drawing words in the air above the smoke, slow, graceful strokes that vanished almost instantly as the steam twisted upward. People called him mad. "What's the use of writing what no one can read?" they would ask. He only smiled. One day, a young woman came to him, her eyes filled with worry. She carried letters she had never sent, some filled with sorrow, others with love, many with regret. She had written them to people she'd lost, to mistakes she couldn't forgive, and to versions of herself she didn't know how to speak to. "I don't know what to do with all these thoughts," she said softly. "They sit in my chest like stones." The old man nodded. He pointed to the brush, then to the smoke curling in the soft morning light. She hesitated. Then, with trembling hands, she dipped the brush and began to write her first letter into the air. There were no envelopes, no ink, no destination, just her breath and the smoke. The words rose, danced for a second, and disappeared. She paused, then wrote again and again. Each letter left her a little lighter. They sat in silence until the last curl of smoke faded into sky. She looked at him and whispered, "It's all gone." He replied, "Yes, and now it can live where it belongs, Snow here." That day, she left her paper behind. She never stopped writing, but she never tried to keep the words again. Moral of the story: not every thought needs to be held. Some truths, some sorrows, some hopes are meant to rise, drift, and disappear. When we let go of the need to preserve every feeling, we make space for peace to breathe through us like letters written on smoke. The next story is called The Door That Opens to Nothing. At the far edge of a crumbling monastery, overgrown with ivy and moss, there was a door built into a stone wall. It had no path leading to it, no sign above it, and no handle to turn. The monks rarely spoke of it. Some didn't notice it at all. But once a year, on the first day of spring, the abbot would quietly walk to that door, bow deeply, and then leave without a word. One year, a curious young monk named Toma couldn't contain himself any longer. After watching the ritual in silence, he approached the abbot. "Master, why do you bow to that door? It leads nowhere. It doesn't open. It's just a wall." The abbot smiled, his eyes soft with age. "It is the most important door in the monastery." Toma tilted his head. "But it's useless. It serves no purpose." The abbot placed a hand on his shoulder. "Ah, and that is why it matters." That night, Toma couldn't sleep. His thoughts wrestled like wind through dry leaves. A door that opens to nothing? How could that be meaningful? The next morning, before sunrise, he walked alone to the door. He stood before it and stared. It was plain, weathered, silent. There was no sound behind it. No air moved around it. He felt foolish, yet he didn't walk away. Instead, he sat before it. He sat for hours. At first, his mind buzzed with questions, then memories, then irritation. But slowly, all of that began to fade. Without meaning to, he had entered a kind of stillness. The door didn't promise answers. It didn't ask for anything. It simply was a space that did not need to be filled. A presence that offered nothing and somehow gave everything. For the first time, Toma didn't try to figure anything out. He didn't chase meaning. He simply breathed. He felt the silence of the wall, the breath of the wind, the warmth of the sun rising behind him. And in doing nothing, he discovered everything he had been seeking. Moral of the story: not all doors are meant to lead somewhere. Some are there to remind us that stillness itself is the destination. When we stop searching for meaning in every moment, we begin to feel the deep peace of simply being. The door that opens to nothing often opens the heart. The next story is called Rain on the Master's Pillow. In a mountain monastery where the clouds often slept among the rooftops, there lived an old Zen master who had taught for over 50 years. He was loved not for his answers, but for his stillness, for the way he could say nothing and yet make someone feel entirely understood. One night, a heavy rain swept across the mountain. The storm was loud, wild, and endless. Lightning cracked the sky, and wind howled through the pine trees like lost spirits. Most of the monks could not sleep. Fear crept into their hearts like water seeping under a door. A young monk, unable to quiet his racing mind, decided to check on the master. As he stepped quietly toward the master's quarters, he expected to find him deep in meditation or writing poems by candlelight. But when he gently opened the door, he found the master lying in his bed, eyes closed, face calm. The strange thing, Wash's pillow was soaked. The window above his bed had been left open. Rain was falling directly onto his pillow, onto his face, onto the bed itself. Yet he did not move. He did not wake. Or if he was awake, he made no sign of discomfort. The young monk stood in shock. Should he close the window, wake the master, do something? But something about the master's face, so peaceful, even with rain pouring down, held him in place. The next morning, after the storm had passed and the temple grounds glistened with soft light, the young monk returned. The master was already awake, sipping tea by the garden. The monk bowed and asked gently, "Why didn't you close the window last night? Weren't you uncomfortable?" The master smiled faintly. "Yes, I felt the rain. I also felt the softness of the pillow. I felt the coolness of the wind, the loudness of thunder, the wetness of the sheets, and then I fell asleep." The monk was puzzled. "But how could you rest like that?" The master looked at him with kind, weathered eyes. "Because nothing needed to change for peace to be here." Moral of the story: we often think peace comes from fixing the world around us, but sometimes it comes from allowing the world to be exactly as it is. When we stop resisting the rain, even a wet pillow can cradle stillness. The next story is called A Fish That Dreamt of Stillness. In a quiet pond tucked deep within a bamboo forest, there lived a single silver fish. Unlike the others who darted, played, and splashed near the surface, this fish often lingered near the bottom, staring upward at the slow dance of light on water. While the others chased insects and ripples, he remained still, lost in thought. He was not unhappy, but he was restless. "Why must I keep swimming?" he wondered. "The water moves even when I do not. The world turns even if I stop. I want to know what it feels like to be completely still." The fish began to search. He swam into deeper waters, hoping to find a place where nothing moved. But even there, tiny currents pulled at his fins. Bubbles rose. Leaves drifted from above. The silence he sought was never total. He asked the turtles, slow and grounded, how they found stillness. "We return to the earth," they said. "But you belong to the water." He asked the dragonflies, whose wings sliced the air like whispers, how they found calm. "We move lightly," they said, "but we are never still." One evening, as the sky turned gold and shadows stretched across the pond, the fish finally gave up searching. Tired, he floated in place beneath a lily pad, letting the water carry him. For the first time, he did not try to hold himself in place. He stopped resisting the current. He stopped chasing an idea of peace. He simply allowed the water to move him. In that moment, something within him softened. The silence he had been searching for wasn't in the absence of movement, but in the absence of struggle. The water had never been loud. His own mind had been. Stillness, he realized, wasn't the end of motion. It was the end of tension. That night, he slept for the first time in a long while, not with his body still, but with his heart quiet. Moral of the story: stillness is not the stopping of movement, but the stopping of resistance. Like the fish who let go of the chase, we find true calm not by freezing the world around us, but by softening the need to control it. Peace lives in surrender, not in escape. The next story is called The Plum Tree That Cried in Spring. In the courtyard of a small rural temple, there stood an old plum tree. It had been planted long before the current monks had arrived, and every spring it bloomed with pale pink flowers, so delicate they looked like breath resting on branches. It was the pride of the temple, watched, painted, and prayed beside each year when the blossoms opened like soft lanterns in the wind. But one year, the plum tree did not bloom. The winter had been harsh, and the monks believed it would simply need more time. They waited patiently, then nervously. The other trees in the forest bloomed and greened, but the plum tree stood still, its branches bare, buds unopened. When the winds grew warmer, the tree remained unchanged. The young monks were saddened. Some thought the tree was dying. Others said its time had passed. But the old master would sit beneath it every morning, pouring tea for himself, and a second cup he left untouched, placed on a stone beside the roots. One day, a student approached him and asked, "Master, why do you still sit with the tree? Why do you pour it tea when it has given us nothing this spring?" The master looked at the bare branches and replied, "This tree has shared its beauty with us for decades. Why should it need to bloom to be worthy of love today?" The student lowered his gaze. Then the master said something softer. "Sometimes things that have endured much cold are not ready to open, even when the world says it's time." That evening, it rained gently. The next morning, the monks found droplets gathered like tears on the tips of the bare branches. The tree had not bloomed, but it had cried, and somehow that touched them even more. They sat with the tree in silence, no longer waiting, just being. The flowers came weeks later, smaller than usual, fewer, but they came, and no one spoke of delay or disappointment, only quiet gratitude. Moral of the story: not all growth looks like blooming. Sometimes surviving is the quietest kind of strength. Even when nothing is visible, something sacred is unfolding inside. Be patient with others, with life, and with yourself. Spring arrives in its own time. The next story is called The Candle That Burned Without Flame. In a small temple nestled at the edge of a wind-blown cliff, there was a candle placed upon the altar. Unlike the other candles used in rituals, it had never been lit. It stood there year after year, untouched by fire, yet never replaced. Dust gathered on its base, but still the monks bowed to it each morning. A new novice arrived one winter, full of questions and discipline. He watched the morning rituals with attention, always taking notes, always eager to understand. But one thing puzzled him deeply. "Master," he asked one day, pointing to the cold waxen candle, "why do we honor a candle that gives no light?" The old monk looked at him, then at the candle. His eyes were soft, his voice gentle. "Because it reminds us that not all light is seen." The novice frowned. "But doesn't a candle exist to burn?" The master nodded. "Yes, and it also exists to be still." The young monk couldn't accept the answer. Each morning he grew more irritated by the sight of the unlit candle. He longed to strike a match, to let it do what it was made to do. One night, when the temple was silent, he crept into the altar room, lit the candle, and watched the flame flicker proudly in the dark. At first, he felt a thrill, but then he noticed the wax dripping quickly, the shape melting, the silence of the room changing. It no longer watched over the space, it consumed it. Within an hour, the candle was half its height. Within 2, it was gone. The next morning, the master said nothing. He simply placed a new, unlit candle on the altar and bowed. Ashamed, the young monk fell to his knees. "I thought I was giving it life," he whispered. The master turned to him and smiled. "And yet, some things shine brightest by not burning at all. Their light is in their presence, not their flame." The monk looked at the new candle and for the first time saw it differently, not as something waiting to be used, but as something already whole. Moral of the story: not all power needs to be shown. Some light does not flicker. Some presence, though quiet, burns eternally. In a world that urges us to prove our worth, the candle that burns without flame teaches us the deep strength of simply being. The next story is called Chopping Wood with No Axe. Far in the northern mountains, where the winters were long and silence seemed to stretch for miles, there lived a solitary monk in a wooden hut by a frozen stream. He was known for his simplicity: no books, no students, no belongings, only the daily rhythm of tea, meditation, and gathering firewood. One day, a young traveler found his way to the hut, desperate for answers. His mind was tired. He had read every book on Zen, listened to every teacher he could find, but still, his thoughts spun endlessly. He couldn't stop analyzing, couldn't stop trying. He was exhausted from seeking. When he knocked, the monk answered without a word, nodded, and let him in. The traveler explained everything: his years of searching, the confusion that remained, the craving to feel peace. "Please," he pleaded, "tell me the final step." The monk said nothing. Instead, he picked up a small basket and walked outside into the snow. Curious, the traveler followed. They arrived at a large pile of logs behind the hut. The monk stood silently before them. There was no axe, no saw, no tool of any kind. Then the monk lifted his hand and, without touching anything, began moving it slowly through the air, as if miming the act of chopping. The traveler stared. "What are you doing?" he asked, frustrated. The monk continued, stroke after stroke, his palm slicing gently through the cold air, breath steady, eyes soft. "This is pointless," the traveler snapped. "You're not cutting anything." The monk finally spoke. "Yes, and neither are you." The traveler blinked. The monk lowered his hand. "You came here swinging the sharpest tools, words, thoughts, effort, but you're chopping at something that cannot be cut." They stood in silence as snow began to fall. "Sometimes," the monk said, "you stop using the axe not because the work is done, but because you realize there's nothing to chop." The traveler sat down in the snow, suddenly tired in a new, quiet way, not from effort, but from the weight of his own trying. He closed his eyes. For the first time, he let everything fall. Moral of the story: peace is not something you carve out by force. When the mind stops swinging, the noise begins to clear. You don't always need an axe to chop wood. Sometimes you need to stop swinging to feel the warmth that was already there. The next story is called The Bell That Rang Without Sound. At the top of a mist-covered hill stood a temple that had no gates, no statues, and no drum to call the monks. But it did have a bell, tall, cast in dark bronze, and older than memory. It was said to be a sacred object, forged by a monk who had meditated for 10 years without speaking a single word. The bell was flawless in shape, yet strange in one way. No matter how hard it was struck, it made no sound. Pilgrims would travel far to see it. Some laughed when they rang it, expecting a deep chime, only to hear silence. Others grew frustrated. "What kind of bell does not ring?" they'd ask. "What use is it?" But the monks never answered. They simply bowed before it every morning as the fog curled around their robes. One day, a young man named Daigo came to the temple, seeking peace from the storm inside his mind. He had lost everything: his job, his relationship, his sense of self. He had read many books, tried many practices, but the noise in his head never stopped. Thoughts hammered against his chest. Regrets, fears, memories like a bell being struck again and again. He arrived just before sunrise and noticed the silent bell standing alone. He watched as the monks bowed to it without a sound, then walked away. After they left, Daigo approached the bell, confused and tired. He struck it gently with the wooden mallet. Nothing, no sound, no echo. He struck it harder. Still nothing, just the soft creak of the mallet against bronze. Frustrated, he sat beside it. "Why won't you ring?" he whispered. "Why does nothing answer back?" He rested his head against the bell, and for the first time in weeks, he closed his eyes not to escape, but to listen. And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't a sound he heard. It was the absence of sound, the pure, endless silence that the bell offered, not just around him, but within him. No noise, no reaction, just space. The bell didn't need to ring. It was ringing in stillness. And for the first time, so was he. Moral of the story: not all bells ring with sound. Some awaken by silence. In a world full of noise, the deepest truths are often the quietest. When we stop listening for the loud answer, we begin to hear what has always been whispering inside. The next story is called Ink Drawn with No Brush. In a quiet monastery nestled between the sea and a field of wildflowers, there lived a monk who had once been a celebrated artist. His calligraphy had been praised across kingdoms, said to carry the spirit of the wind and the silence of mountains. His scrolls were treasured by nobles and monks alike. But one day, without explanation, he stopped writing. He put away his brushes, sealed his jars of ink, and never touched parchment again. Instead, every morning, he would sit on the temple porch and move his fingers slowly through the air-elegant, deliberate movements, like he was drawing something no one could see. Monks watched from a distance, puzzled. His hand flowed like a river through the sky, but there was nothing beneath it. No ink, no marks, just movement. One day, a novice approached him and bowed deeply. "Master, why did you stop writing? You shared so much beauty with the world." The old monk smiled gently. "I have not stopped. I simply stopped needing the brush." The novice was confused. "But how can anyone see your art?" The master traced one more invisible stroke in the air and said, "Who told you art must be seen?" That evening, the novice sat alone and watched the master's silent drawing. He noticed something strange. Though there was no ink, no canvas, he could feel what the monk was expressing. Grace, grief, joy, stillness, all without a word, all without a line. The air itself seemed to carry it. And then the novice understood. The master was not drawing for eyes. He was drawing from the heart and into it. The next morning, the novice picked up a brush. He dipped it into ink. Then, without touching the paper, he moved it gently through the air. He did not need to make a mark to feel what was being expressed. He had begun to understand what cannot be taught. Moral of the story: true expression does not always leave a trace. Some of the most powerful things we share: compassion, presence, stillness, air drawn without brush or ink. When the heart speaks through silence, nothing needs to be seen for everything to be felt. The next story is called The Frog Who Taught the Moon to Wait. Long ago, in a remote mountain village where the nights were longer than the days, there was a deep, still pond surrounded by reeds and silence. In that pond lived a single frogold, slow and unusually quiet. While other frogs croaked through the night, chasing insects and splashing through the water, this one would simply sit on a rock, unmoving, staring at the moon. Every night, like clockwork, the moon would rise over the pond, casting silver light across the water. And every night, the frog would sit, watching, as though he were waiting for something no one else could see. One evening, a young boy from the village wandered to the pond after a restless day. His thoughts were tangled. He was worried about growing up, about making mistakes, about being left behind. He noticed the frog, motionless in the moonlight, and decided to sit beside him, though he didn't know why. The frog didn't move. The boy didn't speak. The moon rose higher. Minutes passed, then more. The boy began to fidget, looking up at the sky. "It's getting late," he muttered. "I should go." Still, the frog did not move. The boy sighed. "What are you doing, old frog? The moon won't wait for you." But in that moment, the moon seemed to stop climbing. The air grew thicker. The wind hushed. Time softened. The boy blinked. Everything was quiet, so quiet that even his thoughts began to slow. His shoulders lowered. His breath deepened. He looked again at the frog, still unmoving, and for the first time he understood. The moon hadn't stopped. He had finally sat still long enough to feel the moment stretch wide open, no longer pulled forward, no longer trapped in thought. In the frog's stillness, he found a kind of time where nothing rushed and nothing needed to be done. The moon hadn't been asked to wait. It just appeared to, because someone had finally paused long enough to meet it. Moral of the story: stillness changes how the world moves around us. When we become fully present, even time itself seems to slow. The frog didn't stop the moon. He simply stopped running, and in doing so, he discovered that the present moment is always enough. The next story is called Sleeping Under a Falling Star. On the edge of a desert where the sands met the sky, there was a wandering monk who never stayed in one place for long. He carried nothing but a thin blanket, a worn bowl, and a heart full of questions. He had left the monastery years ago, not because he lost faith, but because his thoughts followed him like shadows, whispering doubts, even during meditation. Each night, he looked to the stars, hoping for a sign that the silence he sought was more than just emptiness. One night, deep in the desert, he laid his blanket on the cool sand and stared up at the sky, restless. His thoughts swirled. What is enlightenment? Will I ever be free from this noise in my head? Am I wasting time chasing stillness? He felt small beneath the infinite dark, overwhelmed by the weight of questions that never seemed to end. Then, without warning, a bright streak of light tore across the sky, a falling star, brief and brilliant, vanishing into the black. He sat up, breath caught in his chest. He waited for something to happen, an answer, a voice, a realization, but nothing came, just the wind and his heartbeat. He laid back down, more tired than before, and slowly drifted to sleep beneath the endless stars. In his dream, he was still lying on the desert floor, but this time everything was silent, not just around him, but within him. The questions had not disappeared, they simply had no urgency. The falling star had not brought an answer, but it had reminded him of something simple, something easy to forget, that not every light is meant to stay, that beauty can flash and vanish, that we are allowed to rest even without knowing. When he woke the next morning, the sun was just touching the horizon. He felt no grand enlightenment, just a soft, surprising peace. His mind still held questions, but they no longer chased him. He folded his blanket, bowed to the sky, and continued walking. Moral of the story: not every answer arrives with clarity. Some come as silence, some come as rest, and some, like a falling star, come just to remind us that it's okay to stop searching and simply lie beneath the sky exactly as we are. The next story is called The Leaf That Refused to Fall. In a quiet forest where the wind whispered secrets and time moved slowly, autumn had arrived. Trees were shedding their leaves in golden waves, releasing the weight of summer without hesitation. The ground below was covered in a soft blanket of amber and red. Every leaf let go except one. At the very top of an old maple tree, a single green leaf clung tightly to its branch. Days passed, then weeks. The wind grew colder, the skies turned gray, but still the leaf refused to fall. "I'm not ready," it whispered to the wind. "There's more I need to understand, more I need to do." The wind, patient and gentle, swirled around the leaf. "But your time has come," it said softly. "Everything lets go, and in letting go, everything returns." "But I'm not like the others," the leaf argued. "If I fall, who will I be?" The wind did not push. It simply danced on. Below, a wandering monk sat beneath the tree, watching the lone leaf flutter stubbornly above. He saw in it a reflection of his own heart, mind full of fear, unable to release what no longer served him. He had spent years clinging to identity, to past wounds, to unfinished plans. His meditation was always clouded by the same thoughts. "I'm not ready. I'm not enough." He stood beneath the tree and spoke softly, not to the leaf, but to himself. To fall is not to end. It is to begin again without needing to know where we'll land. That night, a gentle snow began to fall. The forest hushed. The monk remained beneath the tree, wrapped in robes and stillness. Just before dawn, a sudden breeze passed through the branches, not strong, just sure. And the leaf, after all its resistance, let go. It floated through the air with no fear, no name, no plan, just grace. The monk smiled, and for the first time in years, so did his heart. Moral of the story: letting go is not failure, it is trust. Like the leaf that feared the fall, we often cling to what no longer serves us. But when we release our grip, we don't lose ourselves, we find the freedom to become something new. The next story is called Sweeping a Path That Was Never Dirty. At a temple nestled deep in a valley of moss and mist, there was an old stone path that curved gently through the garden. No leaves ever stayed on it for long. The trees around it seemed to lean away, as if in reverence. The wind passed over it softly, never scattering dust. It remained clean, without effort. Yet every morning, before the sun rose, one monk would sweep the path. He did so slowly, with careers if brushing gold from silk. His broom made a faint whispering sound against the smooth stones. Visitors watched in confusion. Why sweep a path that's already clean? They often asked. You could be resting, or praying, or doing something that matters. But the monk only smiled and continued his gentle strokes, one after another, without rush. One day, a traveler arrived tired, bitter, and worn down by life. He had lost things he could not name. He had tried to meditate, to read, to heal, but the thoughts never stopped. Nothing made sense. He walked the temple grounds looking for meaning and found only this monk, sweeping what seemed perfectly untouched. Frustrated, the traveler snapped, "Why waste your time? Can't you see the path is already clean?" The monk paused. He looked up and said softly, "Then why is your heart still heavy?" The words struck the traveler like a sudden wind. The monk lowered his eyes back to the path. "I do not sweep to clean what is seen," he said. "I sweep to remember that even what appears clear must still be tended to, not for the world, for the stillness within." The traveler sat nearby, silent. He watched each stroke of the broom like a breath, soft, steady, present. For the first time in a long while, his thoughts didn't try to fix or run. They simply sat beside him, quiet, like leaves that no longer needed to fall. The path remained spotless, but something within the traveler had shifted, cleared, not by answers, but by presence. Moral of the story: some acts are not done to fix the world, but to care for the self. When we attend to the present moment, even when nothing seems wrong, we sweep the dust the eye can't see. And in that simple tending, the mind remembers how to be clear. The next story is called The Student Who Never Asked Again. In a remote monastery carved into the side of a misty cliff, there was a young student known for his endless questions. He arrived full of curiosity and eagerness, always sitting at the front during teachings, always the first to raise his hand. "Master, what is enlightenment? Master, how do I control my thoughts? Master, why do I still feel restless, even when I sit in silence?" Each day, the old Zen master would answer with patience, sometimes with a story, sometimes with a riddle, sometimes with a smile, and no words at all. But no matter how thoughtful the answers, the student always returned with more questions, more doubts, more seeking. One afternoon, after a particularly long list of questions, the master handed the student a small cup and said, "Go to the stream, fill this with water, and bring it back." The student obeyed, walking down the winding path to the forest stream. But when he dipped the cup into the water, he noticed a crack down its side. By the time he returned, the cup was nearly empty. The master said nothing and sent him again. The second time, the student walked faster, but still, the water was gone by the time he reached the temple. A third time, a fourth. Each time, the cup returned emptier than before. Frustrated, The student finally said, "This cup is useless. No matter how often I fill it, it never holds anything." The master looked into his eyes and said gently, "Yes, like your mind." The student froze. "You come here every day, filling yourself with words and ideas," the master continued, "but you never hold still long enough to let them settle. You ask, and ask, but you never listen. You chase answers like water in a cracked cup." The student bowed deeply and left. That night, he sat in the meditation hall for hours without moving, saying nothing, asking nothing. He watched his thoughts rise and fall, like echoes in a quiet valley. From that day forward, he remained the same student, but he never asked again. And somehow, he learned more than ever before. Moral of the story: when the mind is always seeking, it forgets to receive. True understanding doesn't come from endless questions, it comes when we finally stop chasing and begin to listen in stillness. The next story is called Monk in the Mouth of the Tiger. Long ago, in the dense jungles at the edge of the eastern mountains, there was a wandering monk known for his deep stillness. He carried no food, no fear, and no need for words. It was said he could sit beneath a waterfall and not flinch, or walk through a storm without blinking. But he did not seek attention. He simply walked, breathed, and bowed to life, wherever he found it. One summer, as he traveled through thick forest, he came face to face with a great tiger. It had golden eyes, ribs like bent swords, and a slow, hungry breath. It did not charge. It simply watched him still, silent and ready. The monk stopped walking. The jungle held its breath. For a moment, time collapsed. Most would have screamed, run, prayed for protection. But the monk bowed. Then, slowly, he sat down in the tall grass, just a few feet away from the great beast. His legs crossed, his hands rested in his lap, his eyes closed. The tiger did not move. The monk did not tremble. They remained like that, one man, one tiger, breathing the same air. One with an empty belly, the other with an empty mind. Hours passed. A breeze moved through the trees. Birds returned to song. And then, as if deciding something no human could understand, the tiger turned and disappeared into the trees without a sound. The monk opened his eyes and continued walking. When he returned to a nearby village, someone heard of the encounter and asked, "Were you not afraid? You could have been killed." The monk smiled softly and said, "Yes, but in that moment there was nothing to protect. No name, no past, no future, just breath and the tiger's breath. If it had taken me, it would have taken only what I was never meant to keep." The villagers said he was brave, but he had not been brave. He had simply been present. Moral of the story: fear lives in the stories we tell about what might happen. But when we surrender fully to the moment, even in the mouth of danger, we find something deeper than safety. We find a peace that cannot be touched, even by teeth. The next story is called The Sound of Empty Rice Bowls. In a poor village nestled between two hills, there stood a small temple built from worn wood and quiet prayers. The monks who lived there had little to their names, no gold statues, no fine robes, no grand library. But every day at noon, they rang a single bell, and the villagers would gather to offer what little rice they could spare. The monks received the offerings humbly, one bowl at a time. Some bowls were filled high, others barely had a spoonful, but they accepted each gift with the same bow, the same gratitude. One harsh winter, a famine struck the land. Crops failed. Families went hungry, and slowly fewer people came to the temple. Some days, no one came at all. Still, the monks rang the bell. Still, they sat in silence with their bowls before them empty. A new novice arrived at the temple during this time. He was young and full of questions. After several days of sitting with no food, he finally burst out, Why do we keep ringing the bell when we know no one will come? Why do we hold out our bowls when they stay empty?" The old abbot, his face thin and eyes calm, replied, "Because the sound of the bell is not only a call to receive, it is a call to remember." "Remember what?" the novice asked. The abbot looked down at his empty bowl. "That hunger is not always about rice." That evening, the novice joined the others once again. The wind howled, their bowls remained bare, but something shifted in him. As he sat, he heard the wind as breath, the silence as teaching, the hollowness of the bowl as something more than lack. He realized the empty bowl was not a failure, it was a mirror. It showed him his own expectations, his need for reward, his belief that effort must bring comfort. But the monks, they simply sat, bowls open, hearts open, without demand, without blame. And in that emptiness, there was peace. Moral of the story: sometimes it is the empty bowl that teaches us most. When we stop expecting to be filled, we begin to understand what it means to be open. True generosity begins when we are willing to receive, even when nothing comes. The next story is called "The Lotus That Opened in the Dark." In a quiet pond hidden deep within the forest, far from roads, temples, and the sound of human voices, there grew a single lotus. Unlike the others, which reached for the sun and bloomed in the warmth of daylight, this one remained closed, even in the brightest morning. Days passed, then weeks. The other flowers bloomed and withered, but this lotus stayed tightly shut, its petals wrapped like hands in prayer. Monks from a nearby monastery would often visit the pond for silent reflection. They noticed the lotus but said nothing, trusting nature's rhythm. All except one young monk, who returned again and again, quietly watching the stubborn flower that refused to open. One night, unable to sleep, the young monk returned to the pond under the moonlight. The air was cool, the sky scattered with stars. He sat on the edge of the water, feeling restless, burdened by thoughts he couldn't seem to let go, of regrets from the past, fears of failure, the aching question, "Why can't I bloom like others?" Then, as the breeze softened and the forest hushed, he saw it. The unopened lotus, the one that had waited so long, slowly began to bloom. Its petals spread gently, one by one, reaching not for sunlight, but for the soft darkness around it. It glowed faintly under the moon, pale and pure. The monk sat in awe, tears in his eyes, not from sorrow, but recognition. He realized this flower had never been waiting for the sun. It had been waiting for the night. Some things, he now understood, do not open in light. They open in quiet, in solitude, in the kind of darkness that feels like a secret being held, not a shadow to fear. The next day, he returned to the monastery, changed not because something outside had shifted, but because something inside had been allowed to finally unfold. Moral of the story: not all growth happens in the light. Some blossoms open only when the world is still, when no one is watching, and when the heart is finally ready. There is beauty in blooming quietly in the dark, in your own time, in your own way. The next story is called "The Guest Who Brought Nothing." In a village where cherry blossoms bloomed so gently they looked like snow falling in slow motion, there lived a well-respected Zen master. His home was small, simple, and always open. Travelers came from near and far to visit him, often bringing gifts, rare teas, fine scrolls, sweet fruits. Each was accepted with a grateful nod and a warm cup of tea in return. One afternoon, a man arrived at the master's gate with nothing in his hands. His clothes were dusty, his sandals worn thin, and his eyes tired from a long journey. He hesitated before knocking, ashamed that he had come empty-handed. When the master opened the door, the man bowed deeply and said, "I have nothing to offer you, master. No gift, no wisdom, not even a question. I should not have come." The master smiled and stepped aside. "Then you are most welcome." Confused, the man followed him inside. They sat on the tatami floor, and the master poured tea into 2 cups. The man couldn't meet his eyes. He stared down, gripping the warm cup in silence. The master spoke softly. "Many guests bring things they think. I want rare things, clever questions, impressive stories. But few bring what you have brought today." "But I brought nothing," the man whispered. "Exactly," the master said. Still, the man looked uncertain. The master continued, "When the cup is already full, no more tea can enter. When the room is crowded, no one can sit. When the guest is full of offerings, there is no space for true presence." He leaned forward, gently placing his hand over the man's. "But you have brought me your emptiness, your silence, your truth. And now there is room for something real." The man's eyes welled up not from shame now, but from a strange relief, like he had set down a weight he didn't know he carried. They drank their tea slowly, without words, the blossoms outside falling like soft applause. Moral of the story: we think we must bring something, answers, achievements, beauty, to be worthy. But sometimes our greatest offering is our honest presence. When we come with nothing, we arrive with everything we truly are. The next story is called Listening for the End of Thought. In a temple far from the cities, built atop a hill where even the wind came only as a whisper, there was an old monk known for his silence. He did not teach with words or books. He simply sat in the garden each morning, listening. Novices would often join him, curious and eager, but they soon grew restless. One by one, they would leave, frustrated by the stillness, uncomfortable with the lack of instruction. Only silence was offered, and for many, silence felt like nothing. One day, a young monk arrived, full of doubt and noise. He had tried every method to quiet his mind, counting breaths, chanting sutras, fasting, and even denying sleep. Still, his thoughts returned, louder than ever. He asked the old monk, "How do I silence the mind? It speaks even when I beg it not to." The old monk did not respond. He only pointed to a smooth stone beside him. Confused, the young monk sat. They remained that way for hours, surrounded by birdsong, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional crack of a twig in the distance. Still, no teaching. Still, thoughts. The young monk sighed in frustration, thinking, "He's not going to help me." And then, suddenly, something happened, not outside, but within. He noticed a gap, a breath between thoughts. A moment of stillness, not forced, not chased, just there. It didn't last long. The thoughts returned, but now he had heard what was underneath them. The silence wasn't something to create, it was already waiting, always had been. He turned to the old monk with tears in his eyes. And for the first time, the master spoke. "You cannot push thought away and expect silence. You must listen to the noise until it no longer needs to speak." The young monk nodded, his heart full, though no answers had been given, only space. From that day on, he no longer fought his thoughts. He listened to them, gently, patiently, until one day, without trying, they began to slow. Not because he silenced them, because they were finally heard. Moral of the story: the mind doesn't quiet when we force it to be silent. It quiets when we listen with care. Beneath the noise is not more noise, but the stillness that has always been waiting. You don't end thought with effort. You end it with presence. The next story is called The Teacher Who Tied Himself in Rope. In a humble Zen school on the edge of a riverbank, there was a teacher known for his unusual methods. He taught not through long lectures, but through stillness, gestures, and strange, unforgettable actions that lingered in the hearts of his students longer than any sutra. One morning, the students arrived at the meditation hall and gasped. There, in the center of the room, sat their teacher, completely tied in thick rope. His arms were bound to his sides, legs crossed, torso upright. His eyes were closed, breath steady, body still like a stone in the middle of a river. No one spoke. They thought it was a demonstration, a metaphor, a lesson wrapped in mystery. But when the teacher did not move, not even to open his eyes or greet them, discomfort grew. Finally, one student stepped forward and asked, "Master, why have you tied yourself?" The teacher opened his eyes and said calmly, "Because this is what your minds look like." The students fell silent. He continued, "Every day, you sit here trying to be free while clinging to thoughts, fears, judgments, identities. You struggle and twist inside yourselves, thinking harder, meditating harder, wanting freedom, while tying the ropes tighter with every thought." He gave a small smile. "So today, I decided to become your mirror." They stood in stillness, watching their teacher breathe calm and unmoving, despite the rope. "But Master," another student said quietly, "you are calm. You do not seem trapped." The teacher nodded. "Because the ropes are only real if I fight them." He closed his eyes again. The students sat with him in silence, feeling the truth sink into their bones. The tighter they pulled at their inner struggles, the more trapped they felt. But when they stopped resisting, when they simply sat, something inside began to loosen on its own. When the bell rang at sunset, the teacher opened his eyes, smiled softly, and without any struggle let the ropes fall away. He had never tied them tight. Moral of the story: freedom doesn't always come from breaking the ropes, it comes from seeing that most of them were never tied. The mind binds itself with thought, resistance, and fear. But when we stop struggling, we find that peace was always sitting patiently beneath the knots. The next story is called The Silence Between Bamboo Cracks. In a grove just beyond the temple walls, bamboo grew tall and close, so tightly woven that even sunlight entered carefully. The monks often walked there in the early hours, before the world awoke, when the mist still clung to the stalks and the earth smelled of rain and memory. Among the grove's visitors, one monk came more often than the rest. He was quiet, inward, always watching something others couldn't see. While others listened to birds or the wind, he was drawn to a subtler sound, the soft cracking of bamboo. When the wind moved through the grove, the bamboo swayed gently, and sometimes one stalk would crack not from damage, but from growth. A sudden, dry pop. A split so small it couldn't be seen, only heard. One morning, a novice followed him in. "Why do you come here so often?" the novice asked. The monk tilted his head, listening. A faint crack echoed through the grove. "There," he said. "Did you hear it?" The novice nodded slowly. "The bamboo." The monk smiled. "Yes, it's stretching, growing, but the sound is not the most important part." The novice frowned. "Then what is?" The monk placed a hand on the nearest stalk and closed his eyes. "The silence between the cracks." The novice didn't understand, so the monk led him into stillness. They stood without speaking, listening together, for minutes, then hours. The bamboo groaned and cracked now and then, but far more frequent, more constant, was the silence between. Later, the monk spoke, barely above a whisper. "This is what the mind is like. We hear the loud, moments-anxious thoughts, sudden fear, sharp memory. They feel like cracks. But the true life of the mind happens in the spaces between, the stillness we overlook." The novice stood still, humbled. He had spent years trying to silence his mind, fearing every crack, every noise it made. But now, for the first time, he felt the beauty of what wasn't being said, the space, the breath, the calm that lived just beneath the surface. Moral of the story: growth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in small, quiet shifts. Between each mental noise is a stillness that holds everything together. Learn to listen, not just to the mind's cracks, but to the silence in between. That is where peace begins. The next story is called A Room Full of Unread Books. In a quiet corner of the city stood a forgotten library, once the pride of a great Zen teacher who had spent his life collecting sacred texts, rare scrolls, and ancient wisdom from across the world. Every wall was lined with shelves, and every shelf bowed gently under the weight of untouched books. Some had not been opened in decades. Dust lay thick across the bindings like a soft grey blanket of time. After the teacher passed away, the library remained closed for years until a young student was sent to study there, chosen for his devotion and sharp mind. When he arrived, he bowed deeply at the doorway, then opened the doors. His eyes widened. So many books, so much knowledge, so many answers, waiting in silence. For days, he did nothing but read, morning to night, page after page. He hardly ate, barely slept. Each book gave him more questions, more things to understand. The deeper he read, the more lost he felt. Enlightenment, which had once seemed close, now felt buried under a mountain of words. One evening, as he reached for yet another volume, a loose sheet of paper fell from the shelf. It had yellowed with age and was written in the old master's delicate hand. "To the one who comes after me, you may read every book in this room, or you may close your eyes and listen to your breath. Both are paths, but only one will take you all the way home." The student froze. He looked around at the room, the sacred texts, the wisdom of 100 voices, and yet a silence underneath it, a unread, unspoken, always waiting. He closed the book in his lap. For the first time since arriving, he sat in the center of the room, spine straight, palms open, eyes closed. And he listened not for teachings, but for stillness. The books remained untouched after that, not out of disrespect, but because he had finally begun reading what they had all pointed to. Moral of the story: knowledge can fill a room, but never the heart. True wisdom begins when we stop seeking more to read and start listening to what is already here. Some truths are not written, they are remembered in silence. The next story is called The Gate with No Frame. At the entrance to an ancient Zen monastery, there stood a gate unlike any other. It had no doors, no arch, no walls. In fact, it had no physical structure at all, only 2 weathered stones on either side of a narrow path. There was no wood, no metal, no roof. Yet everyone who came knew this was the gate. Newcomers would often stop in confusion. They looked around, expecting something grand, something visible. Some asked, "Where is the real entrance?" Others walked past without bowing, not realizing they had already crossed a sacred threshold. But the monks never explained. One day, a scholar arrived, well-read, well-traveled, certain he had seen all the great temples. He stood before the path, frowning. "This isn't a gate," he said aloud. "It's just 2 rocks." An old monk nearby overheard and smiled. "Then go around it," the monk said gently. The scholar raised an eyebrow. "There's nothing to go around." "Exactly," the monk replied. "And yet you still hesitate." The scholar grew quiet. He realized he hadn't stepped forward. The monk continued, "The gate does not block you. It invites you. And still, your mind searches for something to measure, to define, to hold. That is the only thing stopping you." The scholar stood still, heart suddenly heavy. He had studied thousands of teachings, searched for the perfect entry into peace, a moment when the door would swing open and tell him, "This is it." But the gate was already here. Just 2 stones. Just a moment. Just now. He took a breath, bowed gently, and stepped through. And though nothing had changed on the outside, something within him felt different, lighter, quieter, open. He understood. The most sacred thresholds leave no marks on the ground, only on the soul. Moral of the story: some gates are not meant to be seen, they are meant to be crossed. The path to inner peace does not always announce itself with signs or structure. It appears the moment we stop searching and simply step into what already is. The real gate has no frame. It is the choice to enter this moment fully. The next story is called How the Pebble Became a Master. At the foot of a sacred mountain, where the river carved its way through moss and stone, there was a smooth gray pebble resting in the stream bed. It had no voice, no name, no temple robes, only stillness. For 1,000 years, the pebble sat beneath the flowing water, unnoticed and unmoved, as countless monks walked past it on their way to meditate, to chant, to seek answers high above. One such monk, young and eager, came to the mountain hoping to find enlightenment. He had studied under many teachers, memorized entire sutras, and performed long fasts and silent retreats. But still, his mind buzzed with doubt. His thoughts followed him like shadows. Peace always seemed just beyond reach. One morning, frustrated after hours of sitting in silence and gaining nothing, he wandered to the river to splash cold water on his face. As he knelt, his hand brushed the small gray pebble resting quietly beneath the surface. It was ordinary, nothing special. But something about its shape, its quiet presence, made him pause. He picked it up and stared at it. "How long have you been here?" he whispered. The pebble, of course, said nothing. He placed it in his palm and sat by the riverbank. Hours passed. The water flowed. The wind moved gently through the grass, and the monk began to realize something. The pebble had done nothing. It had not struggled, not reached, not questioned. It had simply been patient, surrendered, softened not by force, but by time, by stillness, by trust in the river's path. In that moment, the monk wept not from sadness, but from understanding. All his effort, all his trying, had been like thrashing against the current. But this pebble, silent and worn smooth by life, had already learned what he could not force: to be still, to let go, to allow life to shape him, not fight it. He placed the pebble on the altar of the temple that evening, and from that day on, the monks referred to it not as a stone but as a teacher. Moral of the story: true mastery is not always loud or wise or praised. Sometimes it is small, unnoticed, and quiet. Like a pebble in a stream, the soul is polished by surrender, not control. Stillness teaches what striving never can. The next story is called The Master Who Laughed During His Funeral. In a quiet village surrounded by rice fields and slow-moving rivers, there lived a Zen master who was both deeply respected and quietly feared. Not because he was strict, but because he saw through people. His gaze was soft, but it reached places no one wanted to reveal. He had taught for decades, not with sermons, but with questions that unsettled the ego and silenced the clever. One day the master fell ill. He called his students to his side and said only this: "When my body falls away, do not mourn, do not chant, do not cry, just laugh with me." The students nodded, but in their hearts they doubted. How could they laugh while losing the one who had shown them so much? Still, when the day came, they did as he asked. His body was placed in the center of the temple, dressed in a simple robe, his hands resting gently, his face calm. The temple filled with people, monks, villagers, even travelers who had only heard stories of him. Incense filled the air. Silence weighed heavy. Then, as the first monk stepped forward to bow, a soft, strange sound echoed through the hall. It was laughter. At first, no one understood. Heads turned. Some thought it came from the rafters. Others believed someone had laughed by mistake. But the sound came again, clear, gentle, unmistakably familiar. It was the master's voice. A recording, a final teaching, no one could tell. The laughter grew not loud, not mocking, but warm, amused, almost childlike, as if he had just remembered a beautiful joke he had kept hidden for years. One by one, the monks began to smile, then chuckle, then laugh. Not out of disrespect, but because something deep inside them cracked open, something beyond sorrow, beyond thought. It was as if the master's laughter had peeled away the illusion that death was an ending at all. The grief softened, the moment breathed, and in that sacred, unexpected sound, they felt what he had been teaching them all along. Nothing truly ends, only form changes, only illusion falls away. Moral of the story: death is not the final silence, it is just another note in the great song of existence. When we see through the fear of endings, we remember that even in loss, joy remains. Sometimes, the greatest truth is not spoken but laughed. The next story is called The Owl Who Blinked at Enlightenment. In the dense forest beyond the temple walls, where moonlight spilled through pine needles like silver threads, there lived an old owl. Perched high in a crooked tree, she watched the world with wide, glowing eyes. She never spoke, never moved unless needed. She was known by the monks as Maiko, clear-seeing, a creature of deep silence. Many monks believed the owl to be a kind of guardian spirit. She had watched over the temple for years, always appearing at dusk, always still, as if she understood something too deep for words. One restless monk, young and full of ambition, had heard stories of great awakenings, sudden moments of truth, flashes of light, the mind opening like the sky after a storm. He longed for such a moment. Every day he meditated harder, studied longer, waited for the lightning of enlightenment to strike. Still, his thoughts tangled, his breath wavered, and peace felt like a shadow he could never quite catch. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered into the forest and sat beneath the owl's tree. "Tell me," he whispered into the darkness, "what am I doing wrong?" The owl blinked. "Why haven't I awakened yet?" he asked the stars. The owl blinked again. Frustrated, he stood up. "You just sit there, watching. You must know something, but you never speak." The owl turned her head slowly, eyes steady, then blinked once more, longer this time. The monk sighed and sank back down, suddenly tired. "Maybe I've been chasing something that can't be chased," he murmured. "Maybe it's not a flash at all." The forest held its breath. The monk closed his eyes, not to search, not to reach, but simply to rest. In that still moment, something small and quiet rose inside him, understanding without words. Not a firework, not a storm, just the sense that this, the breath, the trees, the owl, the not knowing, was enough. When he opened his eyes, the owl was gone. Or perhaps she was still there, just hidden by the dark. Moral of the story: enlightenment isn't always a lightning strike, it's a blink, a breath, a pause in the chase. Often, it comes not in shouting truths, but in silent watching. And when we stop trying so hard to see, we finally begin to understand. The next story is called The Wind That Carried No Scent. On the edge of a dry plateau where the earth met sky with no apology, a Zen hermit lived alone in a stone hut carved into the side of the cliff. His home was bearing no altar, no scrolls, no fire. Only a mat, a wooden bowl, and the wind. That wind never stopped. It howled in winter, hummed in summer, whispered at dawn. But there was something strange about it. No matter the season, it carried no scent, no dust, no blossom, no rain. Travelers noticed it as they passed, how the wind stirred their robes and hair, but brought nothing with it. It left people uneasy. Some said the mountain was cursed. Others claimed the wind had forgotten the world. One day, a young woman climbed the long trail to the hermit's hut. Her mind was crowded with sorrow. She had lost her mother, her direction, and something even deeper, her sense of who she was. She had lit candles, said prayers, sought comfort, but her grief clung to her like thick smoke, always there, always burning. She found the hermit sitting at the cliff's edge, his eyes on the sky. "I've lost everything," she said, tears in her throat, "and when I try to let go, the pain stays. Why won't it leave me?" The hermit didn't speak. He only closed his eyes and breathed in the wind. She waited, growing impatient. "Why won't you answer?" Still, he said nothing. The wind wrapped around them like a question with no sound. Finally, he opened his eyes and said, "What do you smell?" She paused. "Nothing." He nodded. "Then breathe again." She did. "Still nothing," she whispered. The hermit smiled gently. "Yes, because this wind carries nothing. It moves through the world, touching everything, yet holding on to nothing. That is its freedom." The woman sat beside him, silent. Her sorrow did not disappear, but it began to loosen, like a hand unclenching. She realized she had been holding her pain so tightly, trying to give it meaning, form, identity. The wind, scentless and empty, had no need to carry anything, and suddenly neither did she. Moral of the story: peace is not found in what we carry but in what we learn to let pass through us. Like the wind with no scent, the mind can move gently through sorrow without holding it. Freedom comes not by grasping, but by allowing. The next story is called 2. Shadows. Meditating at noon. At a small temple surrounded by sunlit rice fields, 2 monks often sat side by side for their midday meditation. One was old and gentle, known for his quiet presence. The other was young and eager, known for his constant thinking. Each day, as the sun climbed overhead and cast no shadows, the 2 would sit beneath a large stone lantern in the courtyard. The heat shimmered, the cicadas sang, and their robes barely moved in the warm, still air. One noon, the young monk opened one eye and whispered, "Master, I noticed something." The elder monk didn't reply, but his silence welcomed the words. The young monk continued, "We sit here every day at this exact time, but I realized at noon we cast no shadow. It's like we disappear." The elder opened his eyes gently. "And what does that teach you?" The young monk hesitated. "I'm not sure. It feels strange, as if we have no form, as if we're not really here." The elder monk smiled faintly. "Perhaps that is the closest we come to truth." The younger frowned. "But doesn't that mean we become nothing?" The elder turned to him slowly. "Not nothing, just no longer separate." The wind passed lightly between them. A single leaf fluttered down and landed silently on the stone. The elder continued, "When the sun is low, our shadows stretch long like our thoughts, reaching into past and future. But at noon, when the light is directly above, the shadow disappears. And what is left? Only what is. No past, no future, no self extended in time, just presence." The young monk closed his eyes again, softer this time. He sat without trying to gain anything, without shaping the moment into something to understand. Just breath, just warmth, just now. No reaching, no shadow. Later, when he opened his eyes, the sun had begun to fall. Their shadows had returned, but something in him remained still and bright, untouched. Moral of the story: when we stop chasing who we were or who we want to become, we return to what we are, unshaped, undivided, whole. In the center of stillness, even the shadow forgets to follow, and we remember how to simply be. The next story is called Sweat from an Invisible Climb. In a quiet monastery surrounded by rolling hills and low clouds, there lived a monk who never seemed to leave the grounds. While others hiked to distant caves or journeyed to remote temples in search of insight, he remained within the stone wall, sweeping, cooking, tending the garden, and sitting in meditation before the morning bell. To the younger monks, he appeared simple, even lazy. "He never trains," one whispered. "He never challenges himself," said another. "He hasn't climbed anything but the stairs to the kitchen." But every evening, when the chores were done and the sun slipped behind the mountains, his robe was soaked with sweat. He never complained. He never spoke of pain. Yet his shoulders sagged with a quiet weight, and his eyes, though kind, carried the stillness of someone who had seen something others had not. One day, a curious novice approached him. "Master," he asked, "why do you sweat so much if you never leave the monastery? Are you secretly training at night?" The monk wiped his brow and smiled. "I am always climbing." "But where?" The monk pointed to his own heart. "There are mountains," he said softly, "that leave no path behind. Peaks made of old fears, cliffs of memory, ridges built from guilt and regret. Every day I climb them." The novice grew quiet. The monk continued, "There is a trail inside each of us that no one else can see. Sometimes it leads us into pain we've buried. Sometimes into silence we've long avoided. The climb is slow, and there are no views at the top, only stillness." He picked up a pail of water and walked toward the garden, leaving footprints on the stone floor. That night, the novice sat in meditation longer than usual. He stopped trying to feel peaceful. He stopped pretending to be above his own suffering. He sat with everything, doubt, fear, longing, and let it rise like a steep hill inside him. And by the end, his robe, too, was damp with sweat. Moral of the story: not all journeys leave footprints. Some climbs happen within quiet, unseen, but no less real. The hardest mountains are the ones no one watches you ascend. But when you face them with honesty, each drop of sweat becomes a step toward freedom. The next story is called The Cloud That Smiled. There was once a monk who lived in a temple so high in the mountains that he often found himself above the clouds. While others below worried about rain or sun, he simply sat and watched the clouds drift past his window, like soft thoughts crossing an open sky. Each morning he bowed to the horizon and whispered, "Thank you for coming." Each evening he bowed again and said, "Thank you for leaving." He had no disciples, no sermons, no reputation, just the clouds, the tea, and the silence. One spring, a young seeker climbed the mountain, breathless from effort, hungry for answers. He had heard of the cloud-watching monk and believed he held the secret to peace. When he reached the temple, he found the monk sitting on the porch, eyes gently lifted to the sky. The seeker bowed deeply. "Master, I've come a long way. My mind is filled with confusion. My thoughts chase each other day and night. I can't find peace no matter how hard I try. Please, teach me." The monk nodded and said, "Sit." They sat side by side for what felt like hours, watching the clouds move slowly across the blue. The seeker grew restless. "Master, what are we doing?" "We're watching the sky," the monk replied. "But what are we learning?" The monk smiled. "Watch a little longer." The seeker sighed, but stayed quiet. As the sun dipped lower, one particular cloud caught the seeker's eye. It was shaped like a face, soft and round, with a gentle curve at its center, a smile. A smiling cloud floating silently across the sky. He blinked and pointed. "Master, look, it's smiling." The monk didn't look. He simply said, "Yes, some clouds cry, some just pass, and some, without reason, smile." The seeker's chest loosened. His mind, still full of thoughts, suddenly stopped holding them so tightly. That evening, as they sipped tea in silence, the seeker whispered, "Maybe my thoughts are clouds too." The monk looked at him for the first time and said, "Yes, and not all of them need to be serious." Moral of the story: not every thought must be solved. Not every emotion needs fixing. Some clouds simply pass. And when we stop judging the sky of our mind, we might notice every now and then a smile floating quietly above us. The next story is called A Beard Grown from Emptiness. In a small hut overlooking a stream, far from the nearest village, lived a hermit monk with a long white beard that reached his chest. It moved gently when he breathed and shimmered like spider silk in the early morning light. Many had heard of him not because he preached, but because he had once been the most ambitious student at a grand temple, known for his arguments, his hunger for knowledge, and his sharp tongue. Back then, his face was clean-shaven, always neat, always composed. He debated teachers, dissected sutras, and sought enlightenment like a treasure to be won. But one day, without warning, he vanished. Years later, a young monk, eager and proud like he once was, found the hermit's hut and knocked on the weathered door. The old man opened it slowly, the long white beard flowing like a river down his robe. "Master," the young monk said with a bow, "I've studied all the scriptures. I've memorized the words of the ancients. But still, my mind is not at peace. Please, tell me what I'm missing." The hermit said nothing. He simply turned, sat by the window, and began combing his beard. The young monk waited. Seconds turned to minutes. Still nothing. Frustrated, he asked again, "Please, won't you teach me something?" The hermit looked up, eyes soft and amused. "I am teaching," he said. The young monk frowned. "By grooming your beard?" The hermit nodded. "This beard grew when I stopped chasing understanding. But how? When I emptied myself of wanting to be wise, when I stopped clinging to answers, when I let go of needing to prove anything to anyone, even myself." He gently tugged at a strand of white. "Each hair is a moment I sat in silence, watching my thoughts rise and fall, wanting nothing, holding nothing, not even enlightenment." The young monk fell silent. The wind stirred through the open window, rustling the ends of the old man's beard like leaves. In that silence, the monk saw, wisdom wasn't something you reached. It was something that grew quietly, like hair, not by effort, but by letting go. Moral of the story: true wisdom isn't worn like a badge or spoken with sharp words. It grows slowly in the empty space left behind when striving ends. Like a beard from stillness, it appears not when you chase it, but when you stop trying to be anything at all. The next story is called The Student Who Swallowed the Koan. In a quiet temple nestled between the woods and the wind, a student sat before his teacher, face tight with effort. He had been given a koan Zen riddle not meant to be answered, but to shake the mind free of its usual grip. The koan was simple. What is the sound of one hand clapping? For weeks, the student wrestled with it. He meditated, analyzed, tried to force meaning from silence. He stayed up through the night imagining answers, waves breaking, wind blowing, breath exhaling. Every morning, he presented something new to the teacher, and every morning the teacher shook his head and said, "Not yet." Frustration grew inside the student like a fire that would not burn out. He read sutras, he fasted, he shouted his answer into the forest, hoping the echo would tell him the truth. But silence came back, blank and unforgiving. One evening, filled with desperation, he knelt before his teacher once more. "I can't do it," he whispered. "I've tried everything. I've thought so hard my bones ache. I no longer sleep, I no longer smile. This koan, it's become a burden I can't carry." The teacher poured tea but didn't speak. The student, trembling, said, "I give up." The teacher nodded. "Good, now swallow it." The student blinked. "Swallow it?" The teacher pointed to the center of his chest. "You've been chewing it in your head, but truth cannot be digested in the mind. You must swallow it. Let it settle where thought cannot reach." That night, the student sat in meditation again. But this time, he stopped thinking. He stopped explaining. he stopped trying. He imagined the koan sliding down his throat like warm tea, past his cleverness, past his pride, into the quiet place inside him where nothing needed to be solved. He did not understand the koan, but he no longer needed to. And in that momentha wept, not from knowing, but from the relief of not needing to know. Moral of the story: some truths are not meant to be figured out, they are meant to be felt. When we stop chewing on life and allow it to move through us, we discover a deeper knowing that cannot be spoken, only lived. The next story is called The Garden That Refused to Grow. In a quiet corner of the temple grounds, there was a small patch of earth that had been set aside for a vegetable garden. Every spring, the monks planted seeds with care: cabbage, carrots, herbs, and beans. They watered it daily, turned the soil gently, and offered silent blessings over the ground. But nothing grew. Year after year, the garden remained bare. No sprouts, no green, no life. Just dry, stubborn soil that resisted every effort, every intention. Some monks suggested the soil was cursed. Others blamed the light, the wind, even their own karma. One young monk, especially earnest, made it his mission to fix it. He worked tirelessly, digging deeper, trying different seeds, enriching the soil with compost and ash. He prayed, he fasted, he begged the garden to grow. Still nothing. Frustrated and ashamed, he went to the abbot one morning. "Why does this patch of earth give nothing back? It's the only place in the whole temple where life refuses to bloom." The abbot looked up from his tea and said calmly, "Perhaps it is growing something you cannot see." The monk frowned. "But it's just dirt." The abbot smiled and pointed to the monk's heart. "And how does that grow?" The monk said nothing. The abbot continued, "You think the garden exists to serve your effort, but maybe it's there to teach you how to stop demanding results." The young monk returned to the patch. He stopped planting, stopped forcing. Each morning, he simply sat beside it. He watched the sun rise over its emptiness. He listened to the birds sing above it. He felt the breeze, the silence, the stillness. Weeks passed. He grew quieter, more rooted. He began to understand. This was a garden not for food, but for patience, for surrender, for letting go of needing everything to bloom just because we worked for it. By summer's end, nothing had grown. And yet, something inside him had finally begun. Moral of the story: not all barren soil is lifeless. Some ground exists to teach us that growth isn't always visible, and effort doesn't always mean outcome. The garden that refuses to grow might be showing you the deeper harvest: acceptance, presence, and peace without reward. The next story is called Shoes That Walked Without Feet. In a quiet village along a mountain path, there lived a kind old monk who was known for walking, always walking. Every morning, before sunrise, he left the temple with nothing but his straw sandals and a small cloth bag. He walked through the fields, into the hills, sometimes into towns, always returning by dusk with a soft smile and dust on his robe. He never explained where he went or why. He spoke very little. But over time, the villagers began to notice something strange. Wherever he had walked, something changed. A grieving widow, seen speaking with him by the well, smiled for the first time in weeks. A child who had been too frightened to speak began singing after he passed through their alley. A shopkeeper, once known for his bitterness, was later found sitting silently on the temple steps, holding nothing but his breath. The monk said no wise words. He gave no sermons. He simply walked. And one day he didn't return. The villagers searched for him, but there was no sign, only his sandals placed neatly outside the temple gate. Some believed he had passed on. Others said he had become the wind. But what puzzled everyone most was this. The next morning, footprints appeared on the dirt path behind the temple-perfect sandal prints, fresh in the earth, but no one had walked there. Then it happened again and again. Each morning, a trail of footprints appeared, leading to places the monk had once walked. And wherever the footprints ended, small things happened. Someone forgave, someone wept, someone laughed, someone let go. A child asked the abbot, "Master, how can shoes walk with no feet?" The abbot smiled. "They are moved by kindness that never stopped walking." Years passed. The footprints still came. The sandals never moved, but the path remained alive. Moral of the story: true presence leaves a trail that time cannot erase. When we walk the world with open hearts, our steps keep moving long after we're gone. Even without feet, kindness finds its ways oft as breath, steady as prayer. The next story is called The Hour That Dissolved. In a remote Zen hermitage, where the sun moved slowly and bells were rung not by schedule but by feeling, there was a tradition known only to those who stayed long enough to stop checking the time. Every monk who arrived was first given a wooden tablet with a single hour marked on it: 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, midnight, dawn. They were told, "When your hour comes, go to the meditation hall. Sit and wait." The young monks would cling to their tablets like lifelines. They planned their day around it. They watched the shadows stretch on the floor, waiting for their moment. Some paced. Some whispered to the bells. Some tried to guess the time by the light of the clouds. But there was one more newer than most who grew tired of waiting. His tablet read 2 o'clock. He checked the sundial often. He listened for footsteps, for the creak of the bell rope. He sat in tension, fearing he would miss his hour, but no bell rang, no call came. Days passed. Weeks. Finally, frustrated, he went to the abbot and said, "It has been more than 2 weeks. Still no one has summoned me. I am wasting time." The abbot looked at him with calm eyes and said, "Who told you you were waiting?" The monk froze. The abbot continued, "Time is not a path, it is a net. You are caught in it because you believe there's somewhere else to be." He gently took the tablet from the monk's hands, walked outside, and placed it in the stream. The wood floated for a moment, then slowly sank. "Your hour has come," the abbot said. "It always was." The monk returned to the meditation hall not because he was called, but because he was no longer waiting. He sat, not at 2 o'clock, not at any o'clock, just now. And in that moment, time dissolved. The hour disappeared. So did the monk's longing for it. Only presence remained vast, still, untouched by minutes. Moral of the story: the moment you stop measuring your life by hours is the moment you begin to live it. Time is not the gate to peace, presence is. And when you surrender the weight, you discover that the hour you seek was never ticking, it was already here, dissolving into now. The next story is called Ink That Cried on Paper. In a monastery by the sea, where the walls were always brushed by the sound of waves, there lived a quiet monk known for his writing. He didn't speak much, but each evening he wrote a single line of calligraphy in a worn black notebook. The lines were never shown to others, never read aloud, and never explained. Yet anyone who saw his brush in motion felt something stir like wind touching the surface of still water. One night, a young monk approached him during evening tea. "Master," he asked gently, "why do you write in silence every day but never share what you write?" The older monk looked up from his cup, eyes soft, and said, "Because what I write is not for the eye sits, for what cannot be seen." The younger monk was puzzled. "But then, what is the ink for?" The master didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for the younger to join him in the small room where he wrote. A candle flickered beside the paper. The brush lay still. The master dipped the brush into the ink, and with slow, steady strokes began writing a single character. But as the younger monk watched, he noticed something strange just before the brush touched the paper. A single tear dropped from the master's cheek. It mixed with the ink. The character appeared more faded than usual, softer, as if it too had felt sorrow. The young monk sat quietly, unsure of what to say. The old master finally spoke. "The ink only carries what the heart has not spoken, and sometimes the heart writes in tears." He closed the notebook and placed his hands on it gently, like holding something alive. "These words are not wisdom, they are grief, longing, love, all the things I once tried to hide behind silence. When the ink cries, I listen." The young monk left the room changed. From that day forward, he no longer wrote to impress, he wrote to feel, and some days, when he had no words, he simply let the ink fall. Moral of the story: not all writing is meant to be read. Some ink is meant to weep what the voice cannot say. When the heart is poured onto the page, even the silence between words becomes sacred. The next story is called The Rock That Taught Stillness. At the base of a great waterfall, hidden by thick forest and mist, there sat a large rock, smooth, flat, and worn by centuries of rain. No one remembered how it came to be there. It had no carvings, no name, no shrine. And yet, over time, monks from the nearby temple began to visit it without being told. They would come alone, sit on the rock in silence, and leave without saying a word. There were no instructions, no rituals, just stillness. One novice, curious and eager, asked his teacher, "Why do the monks sit on that rock? What are they doing there?" The teacher smiled and said, "Go and sit. Stay until it teaches you." So the novice did. He climbed down the slope, found the stone, and sat upon it. At first, his mind was loud, counting breaths, labeling sounds, planning what question to ask when he returned. The roar of the waterfall made it worse. He thought peace would feel softer than this. An hour passed. Nothing happened. Another hour. Still nothing. He grew restless. The rock beneath him was cold. The mist soaked his robe. His thoughts shouted louder. "Why am I here? What is the lesson?" But the rock did not answer. It did not speak. It did not move. And somehow, neither did he. Eventually, his thoughts grew tired of hearing themselves. He stopped trying to get something. He stopped resisting the roar of the water. He stopped asking the rock to be anything but what it was. He sat, still, present, alive. Time passed, unnoticed. When he finally stood to leave, he bowed not out of tradition, but from deep understanding. The rock had not given him wisdom. It had reminded him that he already had it. That stillness was not something to achieve. It was something to return to, just like the rock, unmoving, unworried, completely itself in every moment. Moral of the story: stillness doesn't always come through silence or escape, it comes through acceptance. When we stop demanding answers and simply sit with what is, we remember the steadiness already within us. Like the rock, peace doesn't chase anything, it just is. The next story is called The Laugh Hidden in a Bow. In a hilltop temple where wind passed through every room like a guest, there was a teacher known not for his lectures, but for the way he bowed. He bowed when greeting. He bowed before meals. He bowed to trees, to insects, to clouds. His bow was deep not from habit, but from some quiet joy that no one could quite explain. The younger monks began to notice something strange. Whenever he bowed, his eyes would glisten, as if holding back a laugh, not mocking, not loud, but something playful, like a child hiding behind stillness. One morning, a student finally asked, "Master, why do you smile when you bow?" The teacher paused, then slowly bent forward again, arms at his sides, spine low and soft. When he rose, his smile remained. "I smile," he said, "because I know there is no one here." The student blinked. "But you're here." "I'm here." The master laughed gently. "Yes and no." Seeing the confusion, he motioned to the garden. "When you bow to the sun, do you think it needs your respect?" "No," said the student. "When you bow to the tree, does the tree feel honored?" "No." "Then who are you bowing to?" The student thought, then shook his head. "I don't know." The master leaned in. "That's the laugh." The student frowned. "What do you mean?" The teacher pointed to the center of his chest. "Every time I bow, I remember. The self I'm bowing from and the self I'm bowing to are both illusions. But the act of bowing that is real, that is alive. And that's funny. Beautifully, mysteriously funny." The student sat with the words, feeling something loosen in his chest. That afternoon, as he swept the floor, he bowed to a fallen petal. No one saw, no one needed to. And for the first time, a smile rose in him, not from thought, but from something softer, lighter. It stayed with him like a secret. Moral of the story: humility is not sadness, it's freedom from the weight of self. When we bow with no one to impress and nothing to prove, we may find a quiet laugh waiting beneath the silent sea, reminder that presence itself is the joke we're all learning to enjoy. The next story is called Eating the Reflection of the Moon. In a remote village where the night skies were clear and lakes still as glass, there lived a quiet monk who often wandered beyond the temple at dusk. He never spoke much, but villagers sometimes saw him near the water's edge, staring into the lake as the full moon rose above the hills. One evening, a child followed him, curious about what he did in the dark. She saw the monk kneel beside the water and slowly lower his hands into the surface. With cupped palms, he lifted a small bowl of shimmering moonlight, cradled in ripples. Then, gently, he raised his hands to his lips and pretended to drink. The child gasped. "What are you doing?" she called out. "You can't drink the moon." The monk turned, smiling like someone who had heard a very old joke. "I know," he said, "but sometimes we must remember what cannot be held." She frowned. "But why pretend?" He looked back at the lake. "Because so much of our suffering comes from trying to possess what was never ours. We chase beauty, love, peace, even truth as if we can store it, lock it in our hands, keep it forever." He scooped again, the moon rippling and breaking in his palms before slipping back into the water. "We hunger for what is already here," he said. "But like the moon's reflection, we forget that its beauty is in its presence, not in our grasp." The child sat beside him, watching the soft light shimmer on the water. She didn't fully understand, but she felt something quiet settle inside her. That night, she told no one about the monk drinking the moon. But in her dreams, she saw silver light cupped in her own hands, cool, endless, unheld. Moral of the story: we often chase after peace, love, or happiness as if they are things to possess. But true beauty cannot be owned, only experienced. Like the reflection of the moon, what we seek may already be present, waiting not to be taken, but simply seen. Let go of grasping, and you may finally taste the light. The next story is called The Master's Last Wink. In a misty mountain monastery where the air carried the scent of pine and old incense, an aged Zen master lay on his deathbed. The monks gathered around him, kneeling in silence. He had taught them for decades, not just through words, but through pauses, glances, and moments that felt like riddles spoken without sound. Now his breaths were shallow, his eyes barely opened. The room was still, heavy with grief and anticipation. They waited, hoping for a final teaching, some last wisdom to carry with them after he was gone. One young monk, trembling, whispered, "Master, what is the truth?" The master stirred slightly. His lips parted, as if to speak, but nothing came. Another monk leaned closer. "Please, one last lesson. Still, the master said nothing. Then, just as a tear fell from the cheek of the youngest among them, the master opened one eye, and he winked. A single, slow, deliberate wink. Then he closed his eyes for the final time. At first, no one moved. The room remained silent. The fire crackled softly. The trees outside swayed with the wind, as if bowing. The monks looked at each other in confusion. A wink, that was all? No parting words, no grand truth, no sacred chant, just a playful flicker of the eye? The abbot, seated closest to him, finally smiled. "That was the most perfect teaching of all," one monk asked. "But what does it mean?" The abbot placed a hand over his heart. "It means, don't take it all so seriously." A ripple of laughter passed through the room, quiet at first, then warmer, deeper, cleansing. The grief didn't disappear, but it softened. The sadness was still there, but now it shared space with something else, a deep, mysterious joy. Outside, the sun broke gently through the clouds. The wind carried petals across the temple steps. The master had left the world the same way he had lived, without clinging, without fear, with a touch of mischief wrapped in wisdom. Moral of the story: enlightenment doesn't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes it's a wink, a gentle reminder that life is lighter than we think. When we let go of our need to understand everything, even death becomes part of the great cosmic smile. The next story is called The Wall That Let You Through. There was once a monastery known for a strange legend, a wall that could not be crossed by force, but through which a few, over centuries, had simply walked. The wall itself was ordinary, tall, smooth stone, cool to the touch. It encircled the oldest part of the monastery, where the inner garden, said to hold deep stillness, lay hidden. Every monk, at some point, would come to it. Some meditated beside it for days. Others pressed their hands against it, searching for cracks. Some even struck it in frustration, whispering koans, hoping for a miracle. But the wall never moved. One young monk became obsessed. He read every scroll. He fasted. He chanted under moonlight, sat without sleep, touched every inch of the stone. Still, the wall stayed firm. He began to doubt himself. Am I unworthy? Am I missing the secret? The more he struggled, the more solid the wall seemed to grow. Finally, exhausted, he collapsed before it one evening. He stopped thinking. He stopped trying. The questions fell silent. His hands, once clenched in effort, rested open on the earth. In that stillness, he noticed something he had missed every time before. There was no wall. Not really. There was stone, yes, cold and present. But the true wall had been inside him, his urgency, his striving, his belief that peace was on the other side of something. In that moment, he stood not to escape, but to simply be. And as he placed one foot forward, expecting the usual resistance, he passed through. There was no sound, no flash of insight. Just the sudden light of the inner garden, soft and quiet, waiting as if it had always been there. And it had. Moral of the story: the barriers we face often live not in the world, but in the mind that insists it must break through. When we stop pushing, the wall becomes a doorway. What you thought was in your way may have only been your way of thinking. Peace begins not with passage, but with presence. The next story is called The Sparrow Who Knew the Sutras. In the garden of a small countryside temple, where moss grew like soft thoughts across stone paths, there lived a sparrow who visited every morning. She was no different in appearance from any other bird, small, brown, with a flickering flight. But the monks began to notice something unusual. Every day, when the head monk read the morning sutras aloud beneath the old pine tree, the sparrow would land on the same branch above him. And as he chanted, she chirped not randomly, but rhythmically, as if joining him. Some monks laughed. The bird sings with the Dharma, they said. Others wondered, is it just a trick of habit? But, over time, it became clear whenever the chanting began, the sparrow would appear. And if a single word was missed, she would fall silent. If a verse was forgotten, she would tilt her head, waiting. One morning, the head monk fell ill. Another novice stepped in to lead the chant. Nervous and unsure, he stumbled through the lines. The sparrow came but remained quiet. Afterward, she flew down, landed gently on the edge of the incense table, and let out a single chirp, sharp, clear, as if to say, "Listen more deeply." The young monk bowed to her. From that day, the monks began calling her Sutra Sparrow. A traveler once asked the old master, "Do you believe the sparrow truly knows the sutras?" The master smiled and said, "She knows them better than most." "But how?" the traveler pressed. "She cannot speak. She cannot read." The master replied, "Ah, but she listens without trying to understand. She hears without needing to explain. She does not chant to be wise. She chants because she is with the moment. That is the heart of every sutra." The next morning, as the monks chanted beneath the pine tree, the sparrow returned singing softly, freely, without effort. Not above them, not below them, just part of them. And for a brief, beautiful moment, no one thought about the meaning of the words. They simply let them be. Moral of the story: wisdom does not always speak in human language. Sometimes it chirps in time with the heart. When we stop trying to recite truth and start living inside it, even a sparrow may teach us what the sacred really sounds like. The next story is called The Fire That Waited Patiently. In the cold northern hills, where winter lasted longer than memory and silence clung to every tree, there was a small hermitage built of stone and humility. Inside lived a solitary monk, unseen for many months of the year. It was said he had once burned with great passion-debating masters, traveling across mountains in search of awakening, determined to reach the truth through sheer will. But now he simply tended a fire. Day and night, year after year, he fed it with care. Not too much, not too little, just enough to keep it warm, steady, alive. Visitors sometimes came, hoping for teachings. He would nod, offer them tea, and say nothing more. They watched him place small logs into the hearth, as if each one were a prayer. One evening, a young seeker arrived, shivering with questions. He had tried many paths, burned himself out chasing clarity. His eyes were tired, his heart restless. "Master," he said, "I once had a fire too, but now it's gone. I don't feel anything anymore. No passion, no drive, just numbness." The monk looked at him kindly, then pointed to the glowing coals in the hearth. "Look closer," he said. The seeker leaned in. The fire was low, not roaring, not bright, just a soft, deep orange pulse of heat at the core. The monk whispered, "This is what fire becomes when it no longer needs to prove itself." The seeker stared, heart trembling. The monk continued, "When passion is young, it wants to be seen, to dance high and fierce. But when it matures, it learns to wait. It doesn't burn to be noticed. It burns to stay warm, to give light in darkness, to keep going." Then he added, "Your fire is not gone. It's only waiting for you to stop demanding flames and learn to sit beside the coals." The seeker closed his eyes and breathed. For the first time in years, he didn't try to fix the quiet inside him. He simply sat beside it. Moral of the story: not all fire is meant to blaze. Sometimes the deepest warmth lives in what flickers softly, unseen. When we stop seeking intensity and begin tending to what remains, we find that even the smallest ember can outlast the wildest flame. The next story is called The Monk Who Buried His Voice. In a wind-worn monastery hidden deep within the mountains, there lived a monk who, once upon a time, had the most beautiful voice in the land. People traveled for days just to hear him chant the morning sutras. His voice was soft yet strong, like rain falling through pine needles. Each word carried peace, each note wrapped in stillness. But one morning, without warning, the monk stopped speaking. He greeted no one. He chanted nothing. He sat through meditation in perfect silence. When asked why, he simply bowed and smiled, offering no reply. At first, the others thought it was a vow of silence. Days passed, then weeks. Still no sound. Whispers spread through the temple. Some said he had gone deeper into his practice. Others believed something had broken inside him, but the truth was stranger still. One autumn evening, a curious young novice followed him into the forest. Hidden behind trees, the novice watched as the silent monk knelt before a small clearing, dug a shallow hole with his bare hands, and placed something wrapped in cloth into the earth. Then, the monk folded his hands, bowed deeply, and walked away. After he left, the novice crept forward. He gently unearthed the cloth and opened it. Inside was a scroll of lyrics and verses, the very chants the monk had once sung. Folded beneath them, a note in the monk's own handwriting. "I have used my voice like a lantern in darkness. Now the sun has risen. It is time to let the lantern go." The novice stood frozen, the forest silent around him. He understood. The monk had not lost his voice. He had outgrown the need for it. He had spoken for years to guide others. But now, his presence alone said more than words could carry. His stillness spoke louder than sound. He had buried his voice not in despair but in freedom. Back at the temple, the monk continued to live in silence. Yet when he walked into a room, hearts calmed. When he looked at you, your thoughts quieted. And when you sat beside him, you somehow heard what had no sound. Moral of the story: sometimes we speak to light the way, but the deepest truths need no voice. When silence becomes your song, presence becomes your teaching. And in letting go of the need to be heard, we finally begin to be felt. The next story is called Tea Boiled in an Empty Pot. In a quiet temple on a wind-swept plateau, there was a monk known for serving tea to anyone who came to him: strangers, beggars, fellow monks, or wandering souls with tired feet and full minds. His tea was simple, but people said it tasted like peace itself. It soothed even the most restless heart. One day, a scholar visited the temple. He had studied many philosophies, memorized countless sutras, and mastered deep theory. But he still felt something missing, an ache he couldn't name. He came to the monk, expecting some secret teaching hidden in the tea. The monk welcomed him with a bow and offered him a seat. He brought over a pot, set it gently over a small flame, and began preparing the tea. The scholar waited. The pot sat still. No steam rose, no fragrance bloomed. After a while, the scholar grew impatient. "Is something wrong?" he asked. The monk looked at the pot, then back at him. "It is empty," he said. The scholar blinked. "Then why are you trying to boil it?" The monk smiled softly. "To show you how you live." The scholar froze. The monk continued, "You keep expecting peace to rise, joy to bloom, and meaning to fill your cup. But your mind is full of empty water, no presence, only thoughts, no awareness, only concepts." He picked up the pot and tipped it. Nothing came out. You read, you chase, you collect truths like ingredients, but forget to pour the water of attention, the warmth of presence, the flame of stillness. And so, your life boils nothing. It makes no tea. The scholar sat in silence. The wind brushed across the temple walls, soft and slow. The monk walked to a stone basin, filled the pot with fresh water, and placed it back over the flame. Soon, steam began to rise. The scent of tea unfurled into the air like a memory you didn't know you'd forgotten. When the cup was finally poured, the scholar drank it slowly, not for the taste, but for the silence between each sip. Moral of the story: wisdom cannot be brewed from empty attention. Just as tea needs water, peace needs presence. Until we fill the pot with stillness, no flame, no matter how strong, can bring warmth. Fill your moments with awareness, and life itself begins to steep. The next story is called The Bell Tower Without Bells. In a quiet village, wrapped in mist and morning dew, there stood an old temple with a tall wooden bell tower. It reached into the sky like a finger pointing to silence, but it held no bell. Travelers often stopped, looking up in confusion. "What is a bell tower without a bell?" they would ask the monks. The monks only smiled and returned to their sweeping, their cooking, their prayers. One day, a young scholar arrived, full of questions and pride. He had visited many temples, read sacred texts, and memorized chants in 3 languages. When he saw the bell tower, he laughed. "Have you lost your bell?" he asked the head monk. "Surely you should replace it." The monk, old and serene, looked up at the empty frame and said, "It was never lost." The scholar frowned. "But what use is a bell tower if it doesn't ring?" The monk walked with him to the base of the tower. "Come sit." They sat in silence beneath the wooden beams as the wind passed through them. Birds sang in the trees. The scholar tapped his foot impatiently. After a while, the monk said, "Do you hear that?" The scholar paused. "The wind?" "Yes," the monk replied. "And what else?" The scholar listened harder. "Birds, leaves, a child laughing far away." The monk nodded. "Now tell me, what would a bell add that is not already here?" The scholar grew quiet. The monk placed a hand over his heart. "We built this tower not to add sound, but to remind us to listen. Every time someone sees it and expects noise, they are met with silence. That is its ring." The scholar sat back. He no longer saw an empty tower, but a space that pointed to everything he had been ignoring. That evening, as the sun turned the tower golden, he heard more than he ever had: his breath, the sky, the hush between thoughts. And he understood some structures are not made to speak, but to open what's already speaking all around us. Moral of the story: not all sacred things make sound. Some exist to make space. When we stop waiting for something to strike us awake, we realize the bell has already rung in silence, in stillness, in the quiet we once called empty. The next story is called The Day the Wind Sat Still. In a valley where the wind had never once stopped, not for a breath, not for a moment, stood a small Zen temple built from wood that creaked like whispers and paper doors that fluttered with each passing breeze. The monks who lived there learned to chant over the sound of rustling leaves, to meditate with sleeves brushing their cheeks, and to walk with balance against invisible currents. The wind was constant, like a heartbeat. One morning, the monks awoke to something strange. Nothing moved. No leaves stirred. No curtains danced. The wind had vanished. At first, no one spoke. They walked the temple grounds cautiously, as if the silence might break. The birds didn't sing. The trees didn't bend. The air, for the first time, felt heavy. Anxiety rippled through the young monks. "What does it mean?" one whispered. "Is this a sign?" asked another. "Maybe something is wrong." They ran to the old master, who sat calmly in the garden, his robes still for the first time in years. "Master," they said, "the wind, it's gone." He looked up and said softly, "Then perhaps now we can finally hear." The monks looked around, confused. "Hear what?" "The space that's always been beneath the wind," he replied. "The silence that never left." For hours they sat with him. At first it was uncomfortable. The silence pressed against them like something foreign. Without the wind, they couldn't distract themselves. Their thoughts grew loud, their hearts unsure. But slowly, something began to shift. They heard the sound of their own breathing, the creak of bamboo, the far-off murmur of water beneath stone, the beat of their own pulse, the quiet that had always been hidden beneath movement. And then, something deeper than sound, something still. By evening, when the wind returned, it was soft, barely there. The monks didn't flinch, they didn't chase it. They had felt something that didn't move, something the wind could never touch. Moral of the story: we grow so used to movement that we forget what stillness feels like. But when the noise fades outside or within, we don't lose the world, we find its deeper rhythm. True peace isn't the absence of wind, it's the presence that remains when all else stops. The next story is called A Room Swept by Shadows. In the heart of an aging Zen temple stood a simple room with no decorations, no statues, and no windows, just wooden floors, plain walls, and a paper lantern hanging from the ceiling. It was known among the monks as the Shadow Room, though no one truly explained why. It was neither feared nor favored, only used occasionally for quiet meditation. One autumn evening, a young monk was assigned to clean it. He entered with a broom in hand, expecting a quick task. But as he swept the floor, he noticed something strange. Every time he moved, shadows shifted around the room, long, soft, flickering, though the lantern above him remained still. The shadows were not his alone. They twisted along the walls like echoes of others, like shapes from another time. He paused and looked around. There was no one else there, but the feeling of presence pressed into the silence. He swept again. The shadows followed. Uneasy, he went to the abbot. "Master, I think something is wrong with that room. It's full of shadows." The abbot smiled gently. "Yes, that is what it's for." Confused, the young monk asked, "But what do they mean?" The abbot replied, "That room holds what we don't say aloud. Our fears, regrets, the parts of us we try to sweep away." The monk frowned. "Then why send me there to clean it?" The abbot looked at him kindly. "Because you must learn to sweep, not to erase. The goal is not to destroy the shadows, but to sit with them without fear." That night, the monk returned to the room. This time he did not sweep. He sat. The shadows moved across the walls like slow breaths. Some seemed familiar fragments of his past, thoughts he had pushed away, grief he had never named. He closed his eyes, not to escape, but to feel. He stayed until dawn. And when he left, nothing had changed in the room, but everything had changed in him. Moral of the story: we all carry shadows. Peace does not come by getting rid of them, but by gently sitting in their presence. In the quietest spaces, the things we fear most reveal themselves not as monsters but as parts of us, waiting to be seen without judgment. The next story is called Sleeping Beside a Koan. There was once a young monk who could not sleep. Every night, as the others rested in rows beneath the moonlit rafters, his eyes stayed open, staring at the shadows on the ceiling. His mind churned with questions about life, about death, about how to be free. But most of all, he wrestled with the koan his teacher had given him. "What is your original face before your parents were born?" He repeated it like a chant, like a plea, like a chain he could not shake. He tried every technique, long meditations, walking in circles, fasting, silence, but nothing brought him closer to understanding. The koan clung to him like a second skin, and each night it whispered louder in the dark. One evening he went to the old master, worn down and trembling. "Please," he begged, "I can't rest. This koan follows me everywhere. I can't escape it." The master looked at him with a gentle smile, then stopped trying to solve it. The monk blinked. "But isn't that the point?" The master poured a small bowl of rice and handed it to him. "Sometimes a koan is not a lock, it's a lullaby." That night, The monk returned to his mat. He didn't sit upright. He didn't chant. He lay down, breathed slowly, and instead of fighting the koan, he placed it beside him like a friend, like a stone, like a child who didn't need to speak. He whispered once more, "What is my original face?" Then he closed his eyes. The question did not vanish, but it no longer scratched at his thoughts. It rested there quietly, like a warm stone in the palm. He dreamt not of answers, but of stillness. In his dream, he saw his face reflected in water, no name, no history, no need to understand, just presence. When he awoke, the koan was still unsolved, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like breath. Moral of the story: not all questions are meant to be answered. Some are meant to be lived beside. When we stop wrestling for meaning and learn to rest with mystery, even the sharpest koan becomes soft. Peace comes not from solving, but from surrendering to the quiet it contains. The next story is called The Feather That Sank. In a village wrapped in mist and morning song, there was a shallow lake known for its stillness. The water was so calm it reflected the sky perfectly. Clouds, cranes, even falling leaves seemed to float twice, once in air, once in water. A Zen monk would visit this lake every morning before sunrise. He never spoke, never chanted. He simply sat by the shore and watched. The villagers called him the Silent One who listens to the lake. One day, a young man arrived from the city, tired from chasing things that never lasted: status, wealth, validation. He had heard of the monk and came seeking peace. "Master," he said, "I've tried everything to quiet my mind, but it keeps rising again and again, like dust in sunlight. Please, tell me how to become still." The monk said nothing. Instead, he reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small white feather. He handed it to the young man and pointed to the water. "Drop it," he said. The young man knelt by the lake and let the feather fall from his fingers. It drifted gently, danced on the surface, and began to float, just as expected. But then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, it began to sink. First, the tip dipped below the surface. Then, the whole feather, trembling, slipped into the depths without a ripple. The young man stared in disbelief. "I thought feathers float," he whispered. The monk spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "They down, they're dry." The young man blinked. The monk looked into the lake. "But when they've been soaked with too much, even something weightless can sink." The young man lowered his head, tears welling in his eyes. He understood. His mind was not heavy because it was wrong, but because it had absorbed too much: expectations, worries, pain he never released. And so, like the feather, he too had begun to sink under the weight of what was never truly his. He bowed deeply, not for answers, but for the stillness beneath them. Moral of the story: even the lightest heart can sink when soaked in too much. True peace isn't found by floating above life, but by releasing what soaks you. When we let go of what we were never meant to carry, we rise softly, slowly, effortlessly. The next story is called The Teacup That Drank Itself. In a quiet temple perched on the side of a misty hill, there was a peculiar teacup. It sat on a shelf in the meditation hall, dusty and unused, though beautifully made thin porcelain, painted with delicate blue cranes, its rim so smooth it seemed to hum in silence. No one dared touch it, for it once belonged to a revered master who had passed many years before. The monks kept it as a relic, a symbol of his wisdom. But one day, a new student arrived, a boy, no older than 16, full of wonder and clumsy questions. While sweeping the hall, he noticed the teacup and asked, "Why doesn't anyone use it?" An older monk smiled and said, "Because that cup once drank itself empty." The boy blinked. "What does that mean?" "You'll know," the monk replied. if you keep sweeping. So the boy did. Days became weeks. He swept the floor, sat in silence, served meals. But the phrase lingered, a teacup that drank itself. One evening, after the final bell, he returned to the hall alone. The moonlight slipped through the paper walls. The teacup glowed faintly on its shelf. He sat before it and imagined pouring tea into it, filling it to the brim. Then he imagined the cup turning inward, gently tipping, pouring its contents not outward, but back into itself. A circle, a loop. Nothing gained, nothing lost. Suddenly, something inside him softened. He saw his own mind in that couple ways, trying to fill itself with teachings, praise, certainty, identity, always thirsting. But the more he filled it, the emptier he felt. He realized true peace wasn't in adding more. It was in letting go of the need to stay full. He bowed before the cup and left without a word. From that day on, he asked fewer questions, not because he knew less, but because he no longer needed to know everything. He began to live more like the teacup, useful when empty, open without seeking. Moral of the story: we spend our lives trying to fill ourselves with knowledge, approval, answers. But a true vessel serves best when it's empty. Like the teacup that drank itself, wisdom arises not from holding more, but from pouring inward, until even the thirst disappears. The next story is called The Hole in the Sky. High in the mountains, where the clouds drifted low enough to touch, there was a monastery known for its silence and sky-gazing. The monks there spent hours each day simply looking up, not to study the stars or predict the weather, but to witness the vastness of the sky. One winter morning, a young monk sat alone in the courtyard, his thoughts heavy and knotted. He had tried to meditate, chant, and walk in mindfulness, but still his heart felt restless. He looked up, as he had been taught, seeking peace in the open sky. But what he saw startled him. There, in the middle of the wide blue, was a dark, motionless patch. A hole. It wasn't a cloud, it wasn't a bird. It was something else seen, emptiness, silent and still, suspended in a sky that usually offered only movement. He blinked. It remained. He called for the head monk. "Master, there's something wrong with the sky." The elder monk walked quietly to his side and looked up. "Yes," he said softly, "I've seen that before." "What is it?" the young monk asked. "Why is it there?" The master closed his eyes for a moment. "Sometimes, when we stare into the sky long enough, it stares back." The young monk's breath caught. The master continued, "It's not a hole in the sky, it's a hole in you. The part you've been trying to avoid, a question you've buried, a grief you never named. And now, the sky is kind enough to show it to you." The young monk sat in silence. He felt exposed, unsettled. "Don't run from it," the master said. "Sit with it. Let it open." That night, the young monk returned to the courtyard. The hole was still there, waiting, not threatening, but tender. He stared into it until the thoughts stopped spinning and a stillness rose from inside him, meeting the sky halfway. By morning, the hole had disappeared, but the space it left behind in him felt larger, softer, somehow more alive. Moral of the story: sometimes what we fear is not the sky, but the reflection of our own emptiness within it. When we stop turning away from the hole in our heart, we discover that it isn't brokenness, it's a doorway. And through it, something greater waits to be seen. In the end, these 3 hours of Zen stories were never about adding more thoughts, but gently peeling them away. A bamboo grove taught us patience. A cracked bell showed us beauty in our flaws. A silent clock reminded us that peace cannot be rushed. And time and again, we saw that stillness is not something to chase, it's something to remember. Overthinking is the echo of a mind that forgot how to sit still. But through clouds, feathers, shadows, and even laughter, Zen whispers the same truth again and again. You are already home. Now breathe, be here, let go. Which story stayed with you? Which one spoke to something you couldn't name? Leave a comment below. Your reflection might be the next bell someone else needs to hear. If this journey helped you feel even a little lighter, calmer, or more grounded, subscribe to the channel for more gentle awakenings in a noisy world. The path is long, but you don't have to walk it alone.